In 2018, James and Brittany Campbell decided to do something a little different for their wedding. They flew out to Las Vegas, Nevada, and found their way to the famous Little Vegas Chapel just off the Strip. They were married by a man dressed as Elvis Presley right in front of a classic pink Cadillac. For some people, it might have seemed a bit unusual, but for James and Brittany, it was perfect. It fit them. After all, they weren't a very traditional couple to begin with. Brittany, who was 36 years old, was a ball of energy. She was bubbly, outgoing, and she even described herself as being a little bit crazy. She was the kind of person who lit up a room. James, on the other hand, was 35 and her complete opposite. He was quiet, reserved, and very analytical. He was the type to think things through carefully and rarely ever acted on impulse. This contrast in their personalities wasn't new. In fact, they had dated once before, way back in high school. It hadn't worked out then. They broke up, went their separate ways, and probably figured they'd never see each other again. But life has a funny way of bringing people back together. Nearly 2 decades later, they reconnected by chance. And this time, things were different. They both had something major in common that changed everything. James was a single father, raising 2 young boys on his own. He was searching for a partner, someone not just to share his life with, but someone who could be a mother figure to his children. As for Brittany, she was also single, and she had always dreamed of being a mother. The timing of their reunion just felt right, like it was meant to be. A year after their Elvis-officiated wedding, life threw them another big change. James was serving in the U.S. Navy, and he received new orders. He was being stationed for a couple of years at a naval base in Hawaii. For the family of 4, this was a huge adventure. They packed up everything they owned, gathered their little cat, Mr. Franklin, and left the mainland United States behind. They landed in Honolulu, the capital of Hawaii, ready to start their new life. They moved into a 2-story house in a suburb just a few minutes from the airport. It was a nice, quiet neighborhood, situated at the end of a cul-de-sac. The area didn't exactly look like the tropical paradise you might picture when you think of Hawaii. It was more like a typical American suburb. The houses were all very similar, these cookie-cutter 2-story homes lined up next to each other, many with white picket fences out front. For the Campbells, who were used to life on the mainland, this familiar sight was actually comforting. It helped them settle in. It didn't take long for them to fall in love with their new home in Hawaii. That is, until they started to uncover the house's dark secret. It began in June of 2019, not long after they had moved in. Brittany needed to get something from the garage. Their garage was attached to the left side of the house, and there was a door on the first floor that led directly into it. So Brittany walked through the house, opened that door, and stepped into the garage. She reached for the light switch and flipped it on. What she saw when the light flooded the space made no sense at all. They had only been in Hawaii for a few weeks, so there were still a ton of moving boxes they hadn't gotten around to unpacking. They had stacked them all up neatly inside the garage to deal with later. But now, as Brittany stood there, she saw that almost all of those boxes had been knocked over. Their contents were spilled out all over the concrete floor. It was a huge mess. But what was truly bizarre was that it didn't look like a random act of chaos. It looked intentional. Someone had seemingly gone through the boxes, sifting through their belongings. They had taken out random items and arranged them in strange little piles. The objects in each pile had no connection to each other. In other places, items were stood up in odd arrangements, almost like they were being displayed for a garage sale. Brittany's first instinct was to just back away. She turned around, left the garage, and went to find her husband. She brought James back to the garage door, and he looked inside just as confused as she was. The 2 of them immediately went into the garage and started looking through the mess, trying to see if anything valuable was missing. It was hard to tell for sure given the chaos, but they did have some expensive items packed in those boxes. Those items had been pulled out, but they were still there, lying on the ground. This was a pretty good sign that this wasn't a robbery. So, if it wasn't a burglar, what was it? The only other explanation they could come up with was their two young sons. Maybe the boys had been playing in the garage, gotten a bit too rough, and knocked everything over. But when James and Brittany asked them, the boys swore they hadn't done it. Brittany believed them. James, however, was more skeptical. He thought they might just be lying to stay out of trouble. And if it wasn't the kids, he figured maybe it was one of their pets. They had gotten a dog shortly after arriving in Hawaii, so now they had a dog and a cat. James was trying to find any logical explanation, and he was very dismissive of how genuinely spooked Brittany was by the whole thing. But there was nothing else to do. They cleaned up the garage, put everything back, and tried to move on. About a week later, another strange thing happened. Brittany was home alone one morning, getting ready for the day. She was sitting at her vanity in the master bedroom, carefully applying her eyeliner while a makeup tutorial played on YouTube. As she focused on her reflection, a loud sound from downstairs made her jump. The front door had slammed shut with incredible force. She was so startled, she almost poked herself in the eye. She immediately paused the video. The house was silent again. She called out, "James?" Boys, thinking they must have come home without her realizing it. But nobody answered. Her mind started racing, trying to find a rational explanation. Maybe James and the boys had just opened the door to drop something off, slammed it on their way out, and didn't hear her call. But a part of her felt that something was wrong. The memory of the trashed garage was still fresh in her mind. She had tried to forget about it, but it was always there, in the back of her thoughts. She stood up and walked towards the open bedroom door, which led out into the second-floor hallway. From her bedroom, you could look straight across the hall to her son's bedroom door. In between the two rooms, to the left, was the staircase leading down to the first floor. At the bottom of those stairs, right in front of you, was the front door. The very door she had just heard slam. Brittany cautiously stepped into the hallway. She looked around, but saw no one. She called out for her family again, louder this time. Again, only silence answered. Taking a deep breath, she started walking down the hallway. When she reached the halfway point, she turned left and started down the stairs. The house was eerily quiet. A growing sense of dread was building in her stomach. She quietly called out for James and her sons one more time, but there was still no response. When she got to the bottom of the stairs, she scanned the first floor. Nothing seemed out of place. She walked over to the front door and pulled it open, hoping to see James's car in the driveway or any sign that her family had been there. But there was nothing. The driveway was empty. There was no one around. It was just her. Her heart was pounding now. She shut the front door and made sure to lock it. Then she did a full sweep of the first floor. She checked every single window and every door, making sure they were all securely locked. She went back upstairs and did the same thing, checking every room, every closet. There was nobody else in the house. She was completely alone. She went back to her room, her mind reeling. How could she explain it? She knew what she heard. She had clearly heard the front door slam shut. But there was no one there to have done it. She eventually had to leave the house to go about her day, but the incident stuck with her. That evening, when she got home, James and the boys were there. She brought up the slamming door, asking James if he had maybe stopped by the house earlier. He told her no, he hadn't been back all day. It couldn't have been him. He tried to reassure her, saying, "Don't worry, you probably just left the door unlocked and a draft came through and slammed it shut. You have nothing to worry about." But Brittany knew that wasn't possible. She was meticulous about locking the doors. The idea that she had not only forgotten to lock it, but had also left it ajar just enough for a gust of wind to slam it that hard, it just didn't make sense. But James was being dismissive again, just like he had been about the garage. He told her she was being paranoid and that it was just a door. This frustrated Brittany, and soon they were in a full-blown argument. By the time they went to bed that night, they were angry and not even speaking to each other. They fell asleep in silence. Then, in the middle of the night, Brittany woke up suddenly. She didn't know what had woken her, but she sat up in bed, looking around the dark, quiet room. As she tried to get her bearings, she heard it. Downstairs. It wasn't a slam this time. It was the distinct sound of a door opening and then quietly shutting. Immediately, her senses were on high alert. She stayed perfectly still, leaning forward, listening intently. She had to be sure she wasn't imagining it. And then she heard it again. A different door, downstairs, opening and then shutting. Panic started to set in. She reached over and shook James awake. She whispered urgently, "James, I can hear someone opening and shutting doors downstairs." James was not happy about being woken up. He was still mad at her from their fight earlier, and now she was waking him up in a panic about more doors. He was annoyed. He sat up, clearly not taking her seriously. Brittany could sense his frustration, and she got straight to the point. "James, did you lock the front door before we went to bed?" James sighed. "Yes, I locked the front door." "I'm telling you, you're just hearing things." There's nothing going on in this house. But Brittany was not convinced. She said, "You can think that if you want, but I'm going downstairs to make sure no one is in this house." She got out of bed and walked to the bedroom door. She peered out into the dark hallway. She didn't see or hear anything. Very slowly, she crept down the hall until she reached the top of the stairs. She stood there for a moment, looking down into the pitch-black first floor. She was terrified, but she knew she had to go down there. She had to protect her family. So, one step at a time, she went down the stairs. When she reached the bottom, she immediately looked at the front door. And her heart sank. It was unlocked. Her first thought was, why would James lie to me? Why would he say he locked it when he didn't? Then another thought occurred to her. Maybe it was her sons. Maybe they had gotten out of bed and come downstairs, unlocking the door. That must be what she was hearing. It had to be the boys making all that noise. For a second, she felt a wave of relief. That made sense. But after she locked the front door, she searched the entire first floor, and her sons were nowhere to be found. She went back upstairs and quietly opened their bedroom door. She found both of them fast asleep in their beds. When she gently shook them awake, they were completely groggy and out of it. There was no way they had been running around the house just a few minutes earlier. Now, Brittany was truly terrified. She tucked her boys back in, told them everything was fine, and then hurried back to her own bedroom. She told James what she had found. The front door was unlocked, and the boys were sound asleep. It couldn't have been them. But James was still being dismissive. He told her she was overreacting, that she was just being paranoid, and that the sounds she was hearing were just the house settling. And as he was saying this, they both heard a loud noise from downstairs. The back sliding glass door, the one that led to their backyard, suddenly slammed open and then slammed shut. In that instant, everything changed for James. The skepticism vanished from his face. He looked at his wife, his eyes wide, and said, "You stay right here." He jumped out of bed and ran out of the room. A few minutes later, he came back. He told Brittany that the back door had been unlocked, but it was shut now. He tried to downplay it again, saying she must have forgotten to lock that one too, and that the same draft was probably causing all the problems. He said, "The house is all locked up now. Let's just go to sleep." Brittany couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Are you kidding me?" she said. "There is something weird happening in our house." The garage, the doors opening and shutting. You can't just pretend like nothing is going on. This led to another big fight. Before long, they weren't even talking about the mysterious noises anymore. They were just arguing with each other. Eventually, exhausted, they both just gave up and went back to sleep. For the next few weeks, things in the house were quiet. But Brittany couldn't stop thinking about it. Who or what was opening and shutting their doors? What had happened in the garage? Meanwhile, James continued to act like nothing was wrong. He refused to talk about the possibility that something strange was happening in their home. But then, something strange happened to James when he was all alone. And for the first time, he got really spooked. It was a couple of weeks after the night of the slamming doors. James was home by himself during the day. He decided to sit down and play the piano, which was in their living room on the first floor. He sat down and began to play. After a little while, he started to get an uncomfortable feeling. He felt like he was being watched. The feeling grew so strong that he had to stop playing. He looked around the room, trying to make sure he was actually alone. As he scanned the room, he glanced at the window to his right, which looked out onto the side yard. And he saw it. There was a figure standing right outside the window, looking in. The curtain was drawn, so all he could see was a dark silhouette. It was just standing there, with its arms down by its sides. James was startled. As soon as he reacted, the figure quickly moved away towards the back of the house. James jumped up from the piano bench and rushed over to another window, one that looked into the backyard. He looked outside, but there was no one there. He went back to the first window, the one where he saw the figure, and pulled the curtain back. Again, no one. He tried to rationalize it. He told himself it must have been a nosy neighbor who heard the music and came to see who was playing. Maybe they saw him, noticed them, and ran off before he could get a good look. That had to be it. But deep down, the image of that dark figure in the window really shook him up. However, it was the blanket incident that finally broke through James's wall of skepticism. It was the moment that forced him to admit to his wife that they had a serious problem. Not long after James saw the figure, the whole family decided to go out to a movie. As they were getting ready to leave, Brittany said she wanted to bring a specific blanket with them. It was a family favorite, the one they always used when they were cuddling on the couch. She thought it would be nice to have it at the theater. She went into the living room to grab it, but the blanket was gone. It wasn't on the couch where it always was. She asked James and the boys if they had seen it, but they all said no. She looked everywhere. She checked under the couch, all around the living room, and even went upstairs to search. But the blanket was nowhere to be found. Finally, they just gave up and left for the movie without it. But when they came home that evening, there it was. Lying on the couch, folded up perfectly neat, was the missing blanket. Everyone in the family knew for a fact that the blanket had not been there when they left. So how did it get there? For the next few weeks, James and Brittany did their best to put on a brave face for their kids, telling them that everything was fine. But in reality, the whole family was terrified to be in that house. The strange occurrences were getting worse. At night, the doors would still open and shut on their own. Their dog would start barking uncontrollably in the middle of the night for no reason, and they all shared the same awful, constant feeling of being watched. By September of that year, the family had reached a breaking point. They decided they had to get out of the house, even if it was just for a little while. They needed a break from the constant fear. So they packed their bags, flew back to the mainland, and stayed with family for a week. On September 20th, they got back on a plane and flew back to Honolulu. As they drove from the airport to their house, both James and Brittany were secretly hoping that their time away had somehow reset things, that whatever weirdness was plaguing their home would have just magically stopped. But as soon as James turned onto their street, they knew that wasn't going to be the case. As they drove up the road, they could see their house at the end of the cul-de-sac. And sitting right in the middle of their driveway was James's nice road bike. Brittany turned to her husband. Even though she already knew the answer, she had to ask. "James, were you riding your bike before we left?" James just shook his head, no, his eyes fixed on the house. He hadn't touched it. He pulled the car into the driveway, parking right in front of the garage door. After he put the car in park, he pressed the button for the garage door opener. James was in the driver's seat, Brittany was next to him, and the kids were in the back. They all watched as the garage door slowly began to rise. As soon as they could see inside, their jaws dropped. The entire garage had been completely trashed. It wasn't just that things were dumped out. Things had been ripped apart, shredded, as if a wild animal had been let loose inside. James immediately turned to his wife and said, "We've been robbed." He jumped out of the car and told his kids, "Stay in the car! Do not get out." James then went to the side of the house and grabbed a sledgehammer for protection. He made his way to the front door of the house while Brittany stayed by the car on the phone with 911 reporting a break-in. James reached the front door. He put his key in the lock and turned it. The door was unlocked. With the heavy sledgehammer in one hand, he tried to push the door open, but it wouldn't budge. Something was blocking it from the other side. James put his shoulder against the door and pushed with all his might. Finally, it opened just a crack, just enough for him to see inside. As he peered through the narrow opening, trying to figure out what was going on, a pair of eyes suddenly met his from behind the door. Before James could even react, a man's voice from inside the house said calmly, "This is not your house." And then the man tried to push the door shut on him. An adrenaline-fueled rage took over James. He roared and smashed the door open with his body. He grabbed the man inside, yanked him out of the house, and threw him onto the front lawn. James then stood over him, holding the sledgehammer, and warned him, "If you go anywhere, I'm going to have to attack you with this." The intruder, a 2-3-year-old man named Ezekiel Zayas, didn't try to run. He just stood there on the Campbell's lawn, staring directly at James, unblinking and eerily calm. A couple of minutes later, the police arrived. Ezekiel didn't put up a fight. He was arrested and taken away without any resistance. It was only after Ezekiel was gone that James and Brittany finally went inside their house. What they found was a scene of total devastation. The entire house, just like the garage, had been completely ripped to shreds. But amidst the chaos, they noticed something familiar. There were those strange little piles of random objects, just like they had seen in the garage that very first time. There were stacks of coasters, books, and electronics arranged on various surfaces, but what really caught James's attention were the medical vials. All over the first floor, on tables and counters, were small vials of drugs or chemicals. He knew they didn't belong to his family. Someone had brought them into the house. James made his way up the stairs to the second floor. The upstairs was just as destroyed as the downstairs, a mess of overturned furniture and strewn belongings. But when he turned and went into his son's room, he was shocked. The room was pristine. In fact, it looked like it had been professionally cleaned. The boys' laundry was neatly folded and stacked on a chair. Their beds were made with military precision. All of their toys, which were usually all over the floor, were neatly put away in their proper places. Stunned, James left his boys' room and walked across the hall into the master bedroom. And what he saw in there made an already terrible situation 1,000 times worse. The master bedroom was destroyed, just like the rest of the house. But the bed was different. The top of their bed was clear of any junk. Instead, a towel had been laid out neatly across it, like a tablecloth. And arranged on this towel, spaced apart perfectly, was a collection of knives. Next to the knives, also on the towel, was a laptop. It was a laptop the Campbell family owned, but they rarely used it. It was open, but the screen was dark. By this point, Brittany had come upstairs and was standing beside him. Together, they walked over to the bed, horrified by the display. They touched the keyboard of the laptop, and the screen lit up, showing the last thing that had been worked on. It was a long, typed document, a Word file that neither of them had ever seen before. They scrolled to the top. The document was titled The Omnivore Trials. Below that, a subtitle read, A Rehabilitation for Rat-like People. The rest of the document was like a diary. It was filled with page after page of detailed observations about a group of specimens, and it was terrifyingly clear that the specimens were the Campbell family. The observations were incredibly intimate. The only way someone could have known these details was if they had been watching the family up close almost constantly for days, weeks, and even months. The notes ranged from what time the family liked to watch TV to the private conversations James and Brittany had behind their closed bedroom door. It even mentioned their personal struggle to have another child, something they hadn't told anyone in their family. In the document, the author wrote that the creature, referring to Brittany, needed to stop trying to have another baby and focus on the children she already had. Towards the end of the long document, the author of The Omnivore Trials came to a shocking conclusion. They wrote that in order to rehabilitate these rat-like people, the Campbells, the author would have to perform several surgeries on the specimens. The specific surgeries mentioned were hand amputations and gender reassignment surgeries. Following this conclusion was another section. It was a detailed list of all the surgical tools the author would need to perform these procedures. There was also a list of drugs and chemicals they would need to sedate the specimens before the surgeries began. As James and Brittany stood there reading this in horror, it all clicked into place. The knives laid out on the towel next to them were not random. Those were the surgical tools. And all of those strange medical vials they had seen downstairs, those were the drugs. The drugs that were going to be used to sedate them so Ezekiel could perform his surgeries. It turned out that for months, Ezekiel Zayas had found a way to sneak in and out of the Campbells' home. He had been living there right alongside them since around the time they first moved in. His primary hiding spot was the crawl space above the second-floor bathroom. Whenever he could, he would climb down from his hiding place and move through the house observing the family. Based on the details in his document, it was clear he was watching them not just at night, but during the day as well. He was the one who had trashed the garage and arranged their belongings. He was the one opening and shutting the doors. He was the one who had taken the blanket and then returned it, folded neatly. He was the dark figure James had seen in the window. The document also made it chillingly clear that Ezekiel was getting ready to act. He was preparing to carry out his twisted plan. The Campbells' decision to go on that one-week vacation might have been the very thing that saved their lives. It had interrupted his timeline. And if there was any doubt about whether Ezekiel was capable of such extreme violence, that question was answered after his arrest. While he was in jail awaiting trial for what he did to the Campbells, he allegedly beat his cellmate to death. A guard reportedly walked in and saw Ezekiel punching, kicking, and stomping on the man. The man later died from his injuries. As of today, Ezekiel Zayas is in a state hospital. Doctors are still trying to determine if he is mentally fit to stand trial, both for what he did to the Campbell family and for the alleged murder of his cellmate. It's still a complete mystery what his motives were. We have no idea why he targeted the Campbells or what he hoped to achieve with his so-called omnivore trials. As for the Campbell family, the experience was so deeply traumatic that they couldn't stay in that house. They moved away immediately. For their own safety and peace of mind, their current whereabouts are unknown. They simply vanished, hoping to leave the nightmare of that house, and the man who lived in their walls far behind them. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. It was late in World War II, on a small island in the Philippines called Lubang. One morning, a Japanese soldier named Lieutenant Hiru Onoda moved silently out of the dense jungle. He crouched low at the edge of a massive rice field, his eyes scanning the area. A moment later, another soldier, a man named Kozuka, emerged from the trees behind him. Together, they began to crawl on their bellies through the mud, inching their way toward huge bundles of freshly harvested rice that had been left in the field by local farmers. When they finally reached the first big bundle, Onoda carefully pulled 2 torches from his pack. See, when Onoda had first been sent to Lubang, his orders were very clear. He was to destroy the island's airfield and do everything he could to disrupt the enemy. But almost immediately, the mission had gone completely sideways. Allied forces, the enemy of the Japanese, had launched a surprise attack on the island. The Japanese forces had been forced into a chaotic evacuation, and in the confusion, Onoda and Kozuka had been left behind. They had no idea if any other Japanese soldiers had also been stranded, but for the moment, it was just the 2 of them. Even though they were cut off with no idea if they'd ever be rescued, they still had their mission. Their job was to fight, to attack the enemy in any way they could. And these bundles of rice right in front of them, they knew exactly where this food was going. It was going to feed the enemy soldiers who now occupied the island. And so, their duty was to destroy it. Onoda took a moment, then lit the 2 torches. He handed one to Kozuka. They touched the flames to the first dry bundle of rice, and it went up in a whoosh of fire. Then they started running. They sprinted across the field, stopping every few yards to set another bundle ablaze, until the entire rice field was a wall of fire and smoke. Suddenly, gunshots cracked through the air. The enemy had seen them. Onoda and Kozuka dropped their torches and immediately turned, running as fast as they could back towards the safety of the jungle. This was their routine. It was the rhythm of their entire existence. They would launch a surprise attack, cause some damage, and then retreat back into the jungle where they could hide and regroup. It was the one thing that gave their lives purpose. They were still fighting the war, and they would continue to fight until they were either killed or rescued. They were usually very good at this, experts at disappearing back into the trees before the enemy could zero in on them. But this time was different. As they were running, with bullets kicking up dirt all around them, Onoda heard Kozuka yell out from behind him. He turned just in time to see his only companion fall hard to the ground. A few weeks later, Onoda was alone. He was making his patrol along the north side of the island, just as he always did, but the silence was heavy. Kozuka had been shot and killed during their raid on the rice field. Onoda was now, almost certainly, the last Japanese soldier left on the entire island. He knew that his honor demanded he keep fighting, even by himself. But doing it alone was a whole different kind of battle. He was exhausted. He was depressed. He was surviving on stolen banana peels and whatever scraps he could get from the local farms. It was a truly miserable way to live. And things were getting worse. Ever since the Allied forces had killed Kozuka, they had somehow learned Onoda's name. They had intensified their operations, and now they were hunting for him specifically. Onoda had been forced to abandon his jungle camp and move into a small, hidden underground cave he'd found. But even there, he couldn't escape. He could hear the constant drone of fighter jets flying low overhead, searching for him. Sometimes patrols of enemy soldiers would push into the jungle near his cave. He could hear them calling out his name, telling him to stop hiding and surrender. On this particular day, as Onoda was on patrol, he heard voices up ahead. He instantly dropped into a crouch, hiding behind a large boulder. Soon, 3 enemy soldiers walked into view. They had no idea he was there. Their rifles were slung casually over their shoulders, and they were laughing and joking with each other. But Onoda started to panic. He knew that sooner or later they would spot his footprints in the mud. They would track him right back to his hiding spot. A part of him, a very tired part, was ready for it all to be over, even if it meant being captured. But his training, his sense of duty, took over. He forced himself to raise his rifle, take careful aim, and fire. Months went by. Onoda could tell by the air and the trees that it was springtime. It had been weeks since he had seen any enemy soldiers on his patrols. He was holed up in his underground cave, rereading a worn-out letter he had kept from his family back home. Suddenly, he heard movement directly above him. Then, a voice called out his name. Onoda's instincts kicked in. He grabbed his rifle, ready to scramble out of the cave and start shooting. But before he could move, the person above ground began to speak again. And as Onoda listened, he realized he knew that voice. It was not an enemy soldier. Slowly, cautiously, Onoda crawled out of his cave. When he saw the person standing there, the person who had been speaking to him, he just broke down and started to weep. It was his old commanding officer, the man he had been waiting to hear from all this time. And his commander was walking toward him with a group of other soldiers, friendly Japanese soldiers. Onoda struggled to his feet. He immediately snapped to attention and gave the officer a sharp salute. He asked if he was finally allowed to go home. And the officer looked at him with a sad expression and said, yes, he could. Because it turned out the date was the 9th of March, 1974. World War II had officially ended 29 years earlier. Hiro Onoda had spent almost 3 decades fighting a war that was long over. He had been terrorizing and attacking Filipino farmers, villagers, and local police officers, all of whom he had mistaken for enemy troops. He was still living in a war that existed only in his mind. The Japanese government had presumed Onoda and Kozuka were dead years ago. But after Kozuka was killed and his body was recovered, they realized Onoda might still be out there. They sent search parties to the island to look for him. But Onoda had seen these search parties as enemy trickery, attempts to capture him. He had hidden from every single one of them. It wasn't until he heard the familiar voice of his old commanding officer, a voice he knew he could trust, that he finally came out of hiding and laid down his rifle. When Onoda finally returned to Japan, he was given a hero's welcome. But the celebration was complicated. Innocent people had died because he was on that island, believing he was still at war. He had been a hero in his own mind, but in reality, he had been terrorizing innocent people even if he didn't know it. The whole situation was incredibly sensitive. In the end, Onoda wrote an autobiography called No Surrender. He later became a rancher and moved to Brazil, where he lived until he passed away from heart failure in 2014. Around 11 o'clock at night on the 19th of April, 1958, a 22-year-old man named Frank Esco was driving his pickup truck along a coastal road in Santa Cruz, California. He had 2 of his friends with him in the truck. The road they were on was called West Cliff Drive. It was a beautiful, scenic road that snaked along the top of a cliff right next to the Pacific Ocean. During the day, the view was absolutely amazing. But tonight, Frank couldn't see much of anything. It was pitch black, and the road had no streetlights. The amazing view was completely lost in the darkness. Frank glanced over at his friends. They were both slumped over, half asleep. And to be honest, Frank was pretty close to nodding off himself. All 3 of them were completely exhausted. They had woken up early that morning, driven 50 miles from their hometown to Santa Cruz, and then spent the entire day out on the beach. Now, they were all just desperate to get home and climb into their beds. Frank, in particular, was really anxious to get back. His wife, Margaret, always waited up for him. And right now, she was pregnant with their first child. He really didn't want to keep her waiting all night. So, Frank pushed his foot a little harder on the gas pedal. He sped along the dark road, trying to enjoy what little he could see of the ocean and listening to the sound of the waves crashing below. He started thinking about his wife and their baby on the way. But as he drove, he came up on a sharp curve in the road that he just didn't see in the dark. He was going way too fast. He slammed on the brakes, and the truck began to slow down, but not nearly fast enough. He jerked the steering wheel hard, trying to fight the momentum, but it was too late. The truck spun completely out of control. Frank heard his friends wake up and start screaming. He was desperately trying to keep the truck on the road, trying to pull it away from the edge of the cliff, but it was like the truck had a mind of its own. It just kept spinning towards the edge. In the last second, Frank looked out his driver's side window and saw his headlights flash across the metal guardrail, the only thing separating them from the cliff. He knew in that moment there was nothing more he could do. They slammed into the barrier with a huge crash. He felt the truck lurch forward, smashing right through the metal, and then suddenly they were weightless. He and his friends were falling off the cliff, plummeting down toward the dark ocean below. In that split second, as they were literally falling through the air, Frank squeezed his eyes shut and just screamed along with his friends. He was expecting the truck to hit the water any second. He imagined cold ocean water pouring in through the windows, the truck sinking to the bottom, and all of them drowning, completely helpless. But then, amazingly, Frank felt the truck slam into something incredibly hard. It was definitely not water. And just like that, they weren't falling anymore. There was no water pouring into the cab. Frank was completely disoriented from the impact and the darkness. He couldn't really see what was going on, but he did a quick check on himself. He seemed to be okay. He looked over at his friends, and they were also completely shaken up, but they were alive. Everyone was physically okay. Frank frantically asked them, "Are you guys good?" And his friends, still in shock, managed to say, "Yeah, we're good." Then, almost instinctively, one of his friends on the passenger side slowly opened his door. He carefully leaned out to try and see what had just happened. After a moment, the friend looked back at the other two and just said, "We're stuck on a ledge. We got caught on a ledge." For a second, all three of them just froze. It felt like if any of them moved too much, the truck might rock off the ledge and fall the rest of the way down. But the friend looked out again and said it seemed like they were stable. By some absolute miracle, they had only fallen about 20 feet down the cliff. They had landed on a wide rock ledge that jutted out from the cliff face instead of crashing all the way down into the ocean. Hitting that ledge had almost certainly saved their lives. Frank was so relieved, so amazed at their incredible luck, that he just started to laugh. All they had to do now was carefully climb out of the truck and find a way to flag down a car on the road just 20 feet above them. They were going to be okay. So, Frank's two friends climbed all the way out of the truck. They stood on the rocky ledge on the passenger side, just looking out at the ocean, thanking their lucky stars that they had survived such a horrible crash. Frank wanted to get out and join them. He decided to go out his own door, the driver's side door. But when he tried to open it, he found that it was jammed shut from the impact. So instead, he started to roll down his window so he could climb out that way. At the exact same time Frank was doing this, his friends who were standing out on the ledge turned around to look at him and see what he was doing. Through the windows of the truck, they could really only see his shadowy shape in the darkness. But they watched as he was clearly climbing out of his window, getting ready to join them on the ledge. But the instant he climbed out on the other side of the truck, the moment his body was clear of the window, it was like Frank just vanished. He was there 1 second and gone the next. For a moment, his friends were just confused. One of them called out, "Frank, where did you go? Where are you?" But there was no response. Just silence. So, very carefully, the two friends began to walk around the front of the truck to see what Frank was doing. And when they got to the other side and they saw what was there where Frank should have been standing, they were absolutely horrified. It would turn out the ledge that Frank and his friends had landed on, the very one that had just saved their lives, was not a completely solid surface. Specifically, it was porous. And in one particular spot, there was a hole. A hole just big enough for a person to fall through. And that hole was located on the immediate outside of the driver's side of the truck. That hole, the one that Frank couldn't see in the darkness when he jumped out of his window, was the entrance to an underwater sea cave. Frank had survived the incredible fall, only to fall straight into this dark cave. He had no idea what had happened. He found himself in a network of dark, wet tunnels. There was a little bit of water on the floor, but it wasn't very deep yet. He started trying to find a way out, but he quickly got lost inside the confusing maze of tunnels. His friends were up on the ledge, screaming his name. Rescuers showed up a little while later. But by the time the tide began to come in a couple of hours later, Frank was nowhere near the entrance hole. He was lost deep inside the cave. So when the water level rose, it didn't lift him up towards the exit. It just filled up the space he was trapped in. And he drowned. On the afternoon of the 19th of December, 1966, a 59-year-old man named Dr. Mohammed Ibrahim sat in a conference room inside a government building in Cairo, Egypt. He was there in his official capacity as an employee of the Egyptian government, and he was sitting at a table across from two government representatives from France. He felt incredibly nervous. He had been meeting with these same two men for the last 4 months, trying to reach an agreement with them about a very important diplomatic decision. But so far, they had not been able to make a deal. The reason for the stalemate was that these French representatives wanted Mohammed, who was the Director General of Egyptian Antiquities, to help them put together a huge exhibition in Paris. The entire exhibition was going to be about ancient Egypt. And specifically, they wanted Mohammed to loan them a collection of priceless artifacts from an ancient Egyptian pharaoh's tomb. But Mohammed was deeply afraid to loan these specific artifacts out. He, along with many other people in his field, believed that these particular artifacts were sacred. They believed they should never be transported outside of Egypt because doing so would be deeply disrespectful to the pharaoh himself. So, on this particular day, Mohammed finally decided to be completely honest with the French representatives. He looked at them and said that they were never going to reach a deal because he was simply not willing to loan out these items. He told them it felt profoundly disrespectful to the pharaoh. He knew it probably sounded a little crazy because the pharaoh had been dead for thousands of years, but that was just how he felt. And he wanted them to understand that this wasn't a negotiating tactic. This was something he could not change. Up until this point, Mohammed had been trying to find other ways to make a deal work, but he had never come right out and said that his main objection was this personal feeling of disrespect towards the long-dead pharaoh. So this was the first time the French representatives were hearing his true reason. And from Mohammed's perspective, when he said it, it looked like they almost wanted to laugh. Like they thought he had to be kidding. But when they realized Mohammed was being completely serious, their expressions changed. They shifted in their seats and looked at him with what seemed like sympathy. Then they promised Mohammed that if he loaned them the artifacts, it would not be disrespectful at all. In fact, they argued it would do the opposite. It would actually honor the pharaoh because it would allow people all over France to see and appreciate the incredible artifacts from his tomb. Mohammed and the French representatives went back and forth on this for hours. And eventually, very slowly, Mohammed did start to see their side of things. It started to make sense to him that maybe allowing France to display the artifacts wasn't an act of disrespect, but actually a way of honoring the pharaoh's legacy. And so finally, maybe against his better judgment, Mohammed officially agreed to loan out the artifacts. The deal was done, and the meeting was over. A few minutes later, Mohammed walked out of the government building and onto the busy sidewalk outside. He felt lighter than he had in months. The stressful negotiation was finally over. He didn't have to think about it anymore. It was a huge weight off his shoulders. Now, all Mohammed wanted to do was just go home. He started walking towards the parking lot where his car was parked. He stepped off the curb to head across the street, looking straight ahead, thinking about the day. And as he did, he heard a loud, blaring horn and the screeching sound of tires on pavement. And then, everything went black. It would turn out that the artifacts Mohammed had just agreed to loan out were from the tomb of the ancient Egyptian pharaoh, King Tutankhamun. And Mohammed, along with many, many others, believed that these artifacts were not just sacred, but that they were also cursed. This belief existed because over the years, at least 11 people who had a direct connection to the discovery and handling of these artifacts had died under mysterious or sudden circumstances. It was believed that anybody who disrespected the artifacts or the pharaoh's tomb would face King Tut's wrath. And just minutes after Mohammed finally convinced himself to go against his own gut feeling and agree to loan out these artifacts to France, he walked out of that government building in Cairo and he was hit and killed by a truck. His death made headlines all over the world. To this day, some people will say it was just a horrible, tragic accident. But others insist he was yet another victim of King Tut's curse. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. In the year 2006, a young man stepped off a plane in the hilly town of Cranbrook, which is situated in the Canada province of British Columbia. Cranbrook is located in the province of British Columbia. Additionally, as he made his way through the little airport terminal in the direction of the baggage claim, practically every single person stopped what they were doing and simply stared up at him. This was observed as he made his way toward the baggage claim. A young guy by the name of Isaiah Oego, who was 18 years old and stood at a height of 6 feet 9 inches, was the subject of this discussion. In addition to the fact that he was from Kenya, he possessed a smile that had the ability to make any surroundings more cheerful. Despite the fact that Cranbrook was a very tiny town, he was, without a doubt, one of the most peculiar people that anyone had ever found himself in contact with. Isaiah, this was not a time off for vacation. His goal was to start a new life there because that was his plan. Furthermore, he was the son of a politician in Kenya, and he had exerted an extraordinary amount of work in order to earn a spot at the College of the Rockies, which is the university that is located in the area. His strategy was uncomplicated, yet admirable in its execution. He had the objective of obtaining a degree, locating a line of work that he was enthusiastic about, and utilizing his accomplishments to aid in supplying for his family all the way back in Nairobi. This allowed Isaiah to successfully acclimate to his new life in Canada, where he had recently moved to. When the first semester of his freshman year began, it was immediately clear that he was going to perform substantially better than what would be regarded good. This was the case from the very beginning of the semester. For the most part, he was succeeding in his studies. In addition to being devoted and eager to learn new things, he was also inquisitive. On the other side, he was revered throughout the social world. His huge, genuine smile, his humble charisma, and his superb manners all contributed to the enormous amount of fame that he was able to earn. The Gentle Giant was the nickname that his new friends instantly bestowed upon him, and it was a name that was a perfect fit for him. This moniker remained with him for a considerable amount of time. Even though he was a towering figure, he projected a tenderness and a kindness that put everyone at ease. This was despite the fact that he was tall. When Isaiah arrived in Cranbrook, he met a number of new people, but there was one person in particular with whom he had a more profound connection than any of the others. The name Isaac Hockley was the one that he went by. Despite the fact that Isaac was also a student at the College of the Rockies, he was more interested in something other than the college itself. In addition to being an accomplished photographer, he also worked as a freelancer for the local newspaper. In this capacity, he was tasked with the responsibility of documenting the seemingly little occurrences that took place in their community. The first time that Isaiah and Isaac walked into each other's company was at the tail end of the year 2006. The billiard hall on campus served as the location for the meeting, which was an informal get-together. Both of them were present, and they were playing pool at separate tables. It is possible that they exchanged a brief nod or greeting with one another, but that was the extent of their engagement with one another. A friendship did not develop between the two individuals as a result of the brief interaction. There were just two students present in the same area at that particular moment in time. It was a night in the beginning of 2007 when the occurrence that genuinely strengthened their connection and drew them closer together took place. At this point in time, Isaiah had already started working a part-time job that was an outstanding choice for someone of his stature. Isaiah's job was an amazing decision. A local club was his place of employment during that time, and he worked there as a bouncer. The entrance to that pub was made by Isaac at some point throughout the evening. In order to make this point abundantly obvious, he was not there to meet up with Isaiah. Rather, he was merely out for a drink like everyone else. Isaiah was present at the entrance, carrying out his duties, which included verifying any identification that was presented and ensuring that order was maintained. Suddenly, he became aware of a commotion coming from the interior of the tavern behind him. This occurred without any prior notice. There was a lot of shouting, and there was also the sound of a fight going on. At the moment that Isaiah turned his head, he became aware that his fellow student, Isaac, was in a potentially dangerous circumstance. A gigantic figure who was substantially larger and more powerful than Isaac was assaulting him. Isaac was being attacked by... Certainly, Isaac was not the one who started the conflict. There is no doubt about that. The only thing he was doing was making an effort to defend himself for himself. Without even a single moment of hesitation, Isaiah took immediate action. He did not hesitate for even a single second. Not only did he walk into the pub, but he also galloped in. He was entering the establishment. He was a giant on a mission, leaping over seats and weaving among tables. He stood at a height of 6 feet 9 inches as he accomplished his task. He moved swiftly into the thick of the struggle and defeated Isaac's attacker on his own. In doing so, he was able to remove the man from Isaac and put the situation under control before it could get any more serious. Isaac simply did not know what to say once the disturbance had calmed and the person who had attacked him had been removed from the area. He expresses his utmost thanks to the recipient. In his normal attitude of humility, Isaiah just understated his thankfulness, despite the fact that he made an effort to convey his sentiments of appreciation. As if it were nothing special, as if it were a usual part of his job, he acted as if it were nothing at all. However, for Isaac, it was a very important occurrence that took place. In spite of the fact that these two young guys came from completely different worlds, they were able to form a strong link with one another via that single act of bravery and loyalty. During that particular evening, they were unable to be apart from one another. Over the course of the succeeding couple of semesters, Isaiah and Isaac developed into people who were the closest of friends to one another. They frequently embarked on extensive travels that took them away from Cranbrook and into the gorgeous mountains and huge forests that surrounded the municipal area. They spent a substantial portion of their spare time together, taking advantage of the opportunities that were available to them. The only thing they did was drive around and talk for a lot of hours straight. It was during these rides that they were able to truly get to know one another and become familiar with one another. When Isaiah would reminisce about his life in Kenya, he would describe the streets of Nairobi, which were always full of activity and bustle, as well as the warmth of his family. His father had a political career, and he talked about the pressure he felt to be successful, not for himself, but for the people he loved back home. He went on to discuss about his father's political career. According to him, his father was employed in the political sector. As he listened, Isaac would get enthralled by what he was hearing. On the other hand, Isaac would talk about his excitement for photography, describe how he perceived the world through the lens of a camera, and how he was continuously searching for the ideal shot and the ideal lighting. When Isaiah was growing up, he would relate stories of what it was like to grow up in a little town in Canada, which was a world that was different from the one that Isaiah had experienced. In particular, there was one drive that they would both remember and laugh about for a substantial amount of time after the event had taken place. The route they were traveling on was winding and ran right into the midst of a dense forest. It was nightfall, and they were passing through the jungle. Isaac was able to make his way through the darkness thanks to the headlights of his car, which made a narrow path through the gloom. An enormous, dark creature suddenly materialized on the road directly in front of them after what seemed like a millisecond had passed. There was a young moose there. A beast that is not only gigantic, but also incredibly powerful for its size. Isaac, who had spent his entire life monitoring them, was the one who provided the quick response. He slammed the brakes with complete and utter force and swung the vehicle abruptly, narrowly avoiding a collision in the process. Following a brief period of skidding, he was able to regain control of the vehicle and drive it to safety. They did not face any danger. Only a narrow escape was possible, but that was the extent of the situation. Isaac experienced a rapid return to his normal heart rate, which occurred in a couple of seconds. His health was in good shape. His friend was sitting in the passenger seat, and he turned around to check on how he was doing. Nevertheless, Isaiah was not in a healthy state. His mental state was completely and utterly shaken to its core. The pupils in his eyes were dilated, and he had a pale outside appearance. After that, Isaac was left perplexed. A conversation was started between him and Isaiah, and he was trying to figure out the reason why Isaiah was so agitated about the subject. "Hey man, it's okay," he probably said. "We missed it. We're totally fine, no accident." However, Isaiah disclosed that the near accident was not the thing that had frightened him. He said, "We missed it. The moose was the one responsible for the deed." In the time leading up to this, he had never noticed one. As far as he was aware, there were no other creatures in existence that were similar to it. He was horrified to see his enormous animal that seemed to be almost ancient suddenly emerge from the darkness of the bush. It was a dreadful sight for him to watch. His reaction to it was one of complete and utter surprise. Bringing up the moose story was Isaac's favorite thing to do after that night, and he did it after that night. He would make fun of Isaiah in a humorous manner about his fear of Canada's gentle giants, and it would ultimately develop into a joke between the two of them. Isaiah would be ridiculed by him. In every instance, Isaiah would laugh right along with him, and his loud voice would reverberate throughout the vehicle. The whole thing was done in a light-hearted manner, as a love jab, and Isaiah would always laugh right with him. The lives of both of the young men were extremely satisfying. In addition to having a strong friendship with one another, they were putting in a lot of effort to accomplish what they had set out to do, and the future seemed to be bright. The flip side of the coin was that everything was about to undergo a sudden and disastrous finish. 2008 was the year that the year was. By the time Isaiah arrived in Canada for the first time, it had been 2 years since he had arrived there. On the 13th of May, which was a bright and sunny spring day, Isaac Hockley was the recipient of a phone notification. It was the newspaper in the nearby town, which was his place of employment. Due to the fact that the town had been the location of an accident, they demanded that he get at the spot as quickly as possible in order to snap some images. There was a helicopter that had been flying over Cranbrook at the time. The operation consisted of doing a routine survey of power lines, which was something that normally took place on a regular basis. On the other hand, a dreadful incident occurred to the circumstance. Following a power failure that occurred in the middle of the flight, the helicopter had dropped from the sky and crashed right in the middle of the center of the town. The pilot, along with the 2 surveyors who were sitting in the back, were all killed when the aircraft came into contact with the ground. Everyone who lives in Cranbrook could not believe what they heard when they heard the news. First of all, the occurrence that had place was a dreadful one. The other side of the coin is that occurrences of this kind simply did not take place at that location. Cranbrook was a drab and sleepy place to be in because of its location. The central business center had never before been the site of a tragic event such as a helicopter crash. This had never happened before. The next thing that happened was that Isaac gathered his camera equipment, got into his vehicle, and started driving in the direction of the accident scene. He had no trouble recognizing the warning signs that indicated the oncoming disaster that was unfolding before him. Despite the fact that the sky was entirely clear, there was a massive cloud of dark smoke ascending into the sky. As he got closer to the place, he noticed that there was a large throng collecting at the intersection of 10th Street and 14th Street. He spotted this as he approached the location. At that moment, each and every one of them was fixated on the scene that was taking place in the middle of the road. They were swarming the pavements, and some of them were even standing on the buildings that were adjacent to them. A massive, twisted heap of jagged metal that was engulfed in flames was situated in the center of everything that was taking place at the time. When he looked at the debris from a distance, he noticed that there was a big plume of smoke coming out of it. Flashing lights could be seen coming from the ambulances that had arrived at the incident on the scene. The police had placed a blockade around the designated area. Putting out the fire was a difficult task for the firefighters who were attempting to put out the fire. They had to fight the fierce fire and try to put out the flames. As soon as Isaac had parked his truck, he made a beeline toward the gathering that was taking place. It was in his role as a member of the press that he made his way through the mob of onlookers until he reached the head of the line, where he was standing directly against the police tape. He began working on his project after raising his camera to his eye and focusing it on the subject at hand. The first thing he did was start taking photographs. He was initially drawn to the debris itself, which featured the twisted metal and the blazing flames. His attention was initially pulled to the debris. After that, he moved his attention to the first responders and snapped photographs of the grim determination that could be seen on the faces of the police officers and firefighters who were on the scene. In his documentation, he covered every imaginable facet of the situation. After doing a more thorough investigation, he discovered that the authorities had already covered the bodies of the deceased victims with tarps. In addition to it, he shot images of individuals. In spite of the fact that it was a challenging and depressing obligation, it was his job to record the events that had taken place. While Isaac was hitting the shutter button over and over again, he had no idea that the images he was taking were about to take on a horrifying, new, and very personal significance for him. He was completely unaware of this fact. Isaiah Oigo finished his final class earlier that day, just before 1 o'clock in the afternoon. He had been attending classes regularly. Each and every one of his classes was finished. While the summer was coming to an end, the semester was also coming to an end. We were on the verge of entering the warm weather. After class, he was in the process of packing his bags when he suddenly recalled something that had occurred earlier. It was in his backpack that he concealed a few letters for the purpose of keeping them secure. In spite of the fact that it had been a few days since he had intended to send them to his family in Kenya, he had written them down and sent them to them. Following the conclusion of the decision, he came to the conclusion that in order to finally send them off, he would make a small detour to the post office at some point on his way home. In the bright and pleasant sunshine of the May afternoon, he strolled out of the classroom building and into the surrounding environment. We were in the midst of his lesson at that moment. The weather was really breathtaking. He most likely wore his headphones and switched on some music to listen to while he was walking. There is a significant likelihood that he did this simultaneously. He was just a young man going about his day, thinking about his family who lived hundreds of miles away from wherever he was as he was carrying out his daily activities. On the hour, it was around 1:05 p.m. by the time he arrived at the post office to check in. In spite of the fact that he was just inside for a minute, he was able to successfully deposit his letters in the mail slot during that brief period of time. Following that, he went back outside and re-entered the brilliant sunlight that was present. At precisely 1 minute after the hour, Isaiah was scheduled to cross 10th Street at 1:06 p.m., according to the schedule. At that very instant, the helicopter that was flying overhead and carrying out the survey of the power line encountered a catastrophic breakdown. Additionally, the helicopter was conducting the survey. All of a sudden, it lost all of its power and started to tumble towards the ground. There was a disastrous event that occurred when it landed on top of Isaiah Oigo. In a split second, his life, along with the lives of the 3 other persons that were on board the helicopter, was ripped away from him. The fact that he was listening to music while wearing headphones gives others the impression that he was utterly oblivious to the fact that it was approaching their location. In one moment, he was walking across the street, completely absorbed in his emotions and the music that he was listening to. Then, in the next moment, he vanished without a trace. There was a strange accident that was unbelievable, astounding, and 1 in a million weird. It was a bizarre accident. It was not until later that day, after the uproar had subsided and Isaac had returned home, that the entire tragedy of the situation became immediately clear to everyone. Taking a seat at his computer, he went through the process of going over the images that he had taken all by himself. The fact that he did it on a consistent basis was a requirement of his job. He was the one who was responsible for uploading the images, analyzing them, and selecting the ones that were the most appropriate to send to the newspaper. The following photo was the one he moved on to after clicking on each of the previous ones. Specifically, it is the fire. The shattered remains of the automobile. The expressions on the faces of those who were watching were a combination of fear and a macabre curiosity with what was happening. Those members of law enforcement who are responsible for securing the region, a bunch of firefighters, each using their own hoses to extinguish fires. Following that, he moved on to the more expansive photographs, which were the ones that depicted the surroundings of the disaster in their entirety, including the tarps that were covering the victims. While he was carrying out his responsibilities in a methodical manner, he became aware of something that caught his attention. There was a rucksack that could be seen in close proximity to one of the victims that had been covered with photography in one of the images. Not more than a few steps away from the disaster, it was lying on the pavement next to the ruins. By zooming in, he makes the image more prominent. Suddenly, his heart stopped beating. This particular backpack was the one that he recognized. Not only was it a fairly specific design, but it was also one that he recalled having seen 100 times before. He was the owner of it, Isaiah, Frosty, and Frosty was the feeling of fear that he had at that moment. It is not possible to do that. The work could not be accomplished. It is impossible that the event did not occur by chance. It is probable that another individual might have been carrying the same backpack. In spite of the fact that his hands were shaking, he started clicking through the other images in a frantic manner. It was his intention to look for any other possible hint. He also observed a flash of cloth in another shot, which was a close-up of the debris field. This photograph was taken by him. There is a piece of a t-shirt that has not been burned that is lying there for you to make out. It was possible for him to recognize the pattern. He had seen Isaiah wearing the shirt in question just the week before, which was just the prior week. The evidence was becoming more compelling, despite the fact that he was still going through the motions of denied the allegations. Suddenly, a mental picture of the scene appeared in his mind. In an effort to recall the shape that was concealed beneath the cover, he made another attempt. Within the context of maintaining a professional distance, he had made a concerted effort to avoid staring at the individual in question in an excessively near manner. The image, on the other hand, was at the forefront of his mind at this very moment. Both the length and the size are important. It turned out to be a tall person. Individual who is exceptionally tall in height. In the most terrifying way that one could possibly conceive, everything came together all of a sudden and brought everything into alignment. The location of the collision was immediately on the path that Isaiah would have taken in order to get from the college to his house, and he would have followed that path. The crash took place at a time that was just after the completion of Isaiah's last meeting with his class. The suitcase is the cause. It will be the shirt owing to the height. As he pushed himself away from his desk, a wheezing sound emanated from his mouth. Isaac was attempting to get away from his desk. Additionally, the images that he had taken, in addition to the tragic story that he had been tasked with reporting for the newspaper, were not simply about people who he had never encountered before. During the latter moments of his closest friend's life, the story centered on those times. Without any prior awareness, he had been standing there, only a few steps away, snapping pictures of the location where Isaiah had passed away. He had been there without any prior knowledge. The person who was concealed by the tarp was someone he knew personally. According to the news, this person was the fourth victim, and it was reported that they were a pedestrian who remained unidentified. It is known as the Silent Giant. After a brief period of time had passed, the official confirmation was delivered. A pedestrian named Isaiah Oigo was recognized as the victim by the authorities, according to the authorities. The word spread like a shockwave throughout the region, beginning in the relatively small community of Cranbrook, which is located in the vicinity. Everyone knew him well. He was well known. There was no way that you could ignore him. He was the giant from Kenya who was always smiling and hospitable, and he never misses an opportunity to glance up. During that time period, the College of the Rockies declared a state of mourning for the deceased. Those members of the faculty and students who had known him throughout his time at the school were devastated. Within the span of just 2 short years, he had already left such a tremendous influence on a large number of people. Due to his anguish, Isaac was unable to bear the suffering that he was experiencing. The fact that he had anything to do with the calamity, which was both strange and terrifying, was a further insult to the pain that he had already sustained. In the past, the camera had been a source of intrigue for him and a way by which he could build a connection with the world. However, it had now become a source of immense anguish for him. In spite of the fact that they were supposed to serve as an objective record for the newspaper, those photographs had turned into a monument that was extremely personal and terrible for his closest friend. Following the conclusion of the investigation into the helicopter crash, it was discovered that a critical component within the engine had cracked, which led to the unexpected loss of power. This was the cause of the crash. In light of the circumstances, the pilot was unable to take any preventative measures. It was a disastrous event that suddenly took place due to a mechanical failure that was completely unexpected. Despite the fact that the reason of the loss was recognized, it did not help to ease the sadness that was caused by the loss. Following the fact that Isaiah's body had been transported to another location, the procedure of bringing it back to his family in Nairobi was one that was both lengthy and challenging. It had come to the point where his family needed to start making preparations for his burial. It was with such high hopes and expectations for their son's future that they had sent him to Canada. A few minutes before he died away, he had mailed some letters, and they had been waiting for them to arrive. He had mailed them. Instead, they were presented with the most heartbreaking tidings that a parent could ever want to hear in their lifetime. Almost immediately after the occurrence, photographs captured by Isaac Hockley were made available to the general public. Cranbrook was left in a state of shock after the incident, and they related the story of what happened because of it. On the other hand, the photos held a distinct and substantially more profound value for him and for those individuals who were aware of the complete scenario. They stood as a memorial to a friendship that was cut short, a life that was full of potential but was abruptly ended in a fraction of a second on a bright and sunny afternoon. They were a tribute to a life that was also full of possibility. At some point in Cranbrook's history, the narrative of Isaiah Oigo, who was also referred to as the Gentle Giant, became an indelible and devastating component of the school's history. He was the young man who traveled halfway around the world and left an impression on everyone he came in contact with via his kindness and his energy during his visit to their little town. He was the young man who journeyed halfway around the world. In the blink of an eye, a seemingly routine day can suddenly become a sad event. His demise served as a jarring illustration of how precarious life can be and how a day can suddenly become a tragic event. The recollections of that day, in addition to the photographs that he took, would be something that Isaac would have to carry with him for the rest of his life in order to ensure that he would never forget it. A tragic memorial to a link that transcended country boundaries and cultural boundaries, and which ended much, much too soon, is the photograph of his companion, which was taken in his final moments without his knowledge. The photograph was taken without his knowledge. I want to express my gratitude for your presence here today. If you watched the program that was broadcast today, I would appreciate it if you could share your ideas with me in the comments area. Also, bear in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of true crime waiting for you to watch in one sitting right now. You may watch all of these episodes in one sitting till the next time we meet again. What's going on? The 6th of September, 2006, a woman named Susan Kuhnhausen, who was 51 years old at the time, was finishing up her shift as a nurse working in the emergency room in Portland, Oregon. For example, if you were to ask someone who knew Susan to describe her, they would most likely use words like tough, resilient, and caring to describe her, even if they were on the right track. She had been working in the chaotic and high-pressure environment of the emergency room for 30 years. Her current position was in the emergency room. Every single thing that was possible to see had been seen by her. Her arms had burned from performing cardiopulmonary resuscitation, CPR. She had administered intravenous treatment to patients who were writhing around in the throes of withdrawal, and she had held the hands of those who were taking their last breaths. She had done all of these things until her arms burned. Due to the fact that the emergency department was a location where anything may happen at any time, Susan had developed the ability to be ready for anything that might take place there. She, along with the other nurses she worked with, received training in self-defense. This was something that she did. Due to the fact that in their line of work, one never knows what can occur, they make an effort to educate themselves on how to break free from chokeholds and how to properly protect themselves against an unexpected assault. However, Susan's most major problems in recent times have not been taking place at the hospital. This is something that has been happening in recent times. On the inside of the mansion, events were taking place. At that point in time, she had been married to her husband, Mike, for close to 18 years. Things had been pleasant for a significant amount of time prior to this point. Nevertheless, over the course of the preceding few years, the link had become increasingly strained. It had become increasingly difficult for them to communicate with one another, and they had engaged in a number of heated arguments. The situation had become poisonous. At this moment, Susan had reached the point where there was no turning back. When she finally got up the courage to tell Mike that she wanted a divorce, it was only after she had gone through a lot of introspection that she realized she wanted to end their marriage. Mike refused to get a divorce and had no desire to do so. Specifically, he engaged in a violent battle against her in reference to it. As time went on, the disagreements reached a higher frequency, were more intense, and became even more unpleasant. After nearly 20 years of cohabiting in the same property, they found that it no longer provided them with the sense of security that they had previously experienced. A battleground was the atmosphere that pervaded the area. After working a shift that was unusually long, Susan made the decision to engage in certain activities that would help her practice self-care on this particular day. In spite of the fact that it was a very insignificant problem, it appeared to be of huge significance. In the course of her way back to her house, she made a stop at a hair salon in order to get her hair colored. It was a means for her to restore a bit of her identity, and it was a small act of resistance on what she was doing. While she was waiting for her turn, she kept herself amused by browsing through a magazine while she was seated on the chair. On one of the pages, she came across a unique quotation that caught her eye and stood out to her. According to the sentences that were written on the page, "I will not live an unlived life. I will not live in fear." The words seemed to leap off the page and speak to her immediately once they were written. That was the conclusion. Having this experience served as the incentive she needed to see this difficult divorce through to its conclusion, to make the decision to stop being afraid and to start living for herself once more. It was impossible for her to forget the words, and she found herself reciting them over and over again in her thoughts. By the time she got back into her car, which was around an hour later, her hair had transformed to a shade of brown that was slightly different from what it had been before. Consequently, she felt a tinge of relief and optimism as a result of the situation. During the last few miles of her journey, she drove by her neighborhood, which was peaceful and enjoyable to be in. The lawns were exceptionally well kept and groomed, and the houses were really stunning. The kind of setting that was being portrayed here was the kind of place where nothing unfavorable was ever intended to take place. She could see the house as she pulled into the driveway of her Cape Cod home, which was the one that was surrounded by the gray picket fence. She was able to view the house. At first glance, it appeared exactly the same as it had in the past. In accordance with the routine that she followed on a daily basis, she got out of her vehicle and walked to the back of the house, where she entered through the door that led to the mudroom. Upon entering the house, she immediately became aware of a note that had been left on the counter, which was located in close proximity to the microwave. The person who sent it was Mike. It was at this moment that they continued to live together in the same house, despite the fact that she had wanted a divorce at this point in time. They were making an effort to make it work until everything was finalized, despite the fact that it was a situation that was fraught with tension. It was she who took the note off the table. In addition to being succinct, it gets straight to the point. The letter was addressed to Sue and read, Sue, I've had trouble sleeping. I've gone to the beach. I'll see you in a couple of days. Susan placed the letter down and went with her business. There was not a great deal of peculiarity associated with it. It should not have come as a surprise that he would wish to get away for a short period of time, given how stressful things had been. Almost as if it were a source of pleasure. For the duration of the evening, she would not be required to resolve any other disagreements. When she opened the entrance that led from the mudroom into the main area of the house, the kitchen was the first room that she entered. This was because the door was located in the middle of the house. When she opened it, she was met by the familiar high-pitched beeping that was emanating from their security alarm system. This was the first thing that went through her mind. The thought of her day and the quote from the magazine continued to run through her thoughts as she made her way through the house, passing the living room and making her way down the hall to the front door. She was walking toward the front door. Before she left the house, she went outside onto the porch, opened the front door, and checked the mailbox before departing. Only a few bills and some junk mail are in my possession at the moment. Upon her departure, she made certain that the front door was locked, since she had previously entered the premises once more. Following the removal of her comfortable work shoes from the door, she started walking back across the house in the direction of the kitchen in order to formulate a strategy for what she would eat for dinner. During the time that she happened to peek over to her left, she was roughly in the middle of the two sites. With the intention of providing lodging for visitors, they made use of a bedroom that was situated on the first floor. In addition, she became conscious of the fact that it was nighttime. Extremely disheartening. The entranceway gave the impression of being entirely covered by a dense canopy of darkness. I found that to be quite peculiar. Susan appears to have a propensity for falling into routines. Before leaving for her shift at the hospital, she would go through the entire house and open all of the curtains. She would do this before she left. Performing this action was something that she did each and every morning before she could go. The way the afternoon sun would stream in through the windows of the house, warming the interior of the house and making it seem lovely, was something that she enjoyed seeing when she returned home. As she stood there for a few moments, she made an effort to recall the routine that she had followed in the morning. Could it be that I was so forgetful that I failed to remember to open the curtains in that room? To put it another way, it didn't seem to make any sense. It is not appropriate for that room's interior to be so dimly lit. And while she was looking into the shadows of the doorway, her mind was in the process of trying to figure out how to solve this insignificant and unimportant problem. At that very instant, a man who she had never encountered in her entire life had emerged from the direction of the door that led to the bedroom. It was at that moment that he started to get closer to her. Both in terms of his height and his frame, he was of a rather average height. He had his hat pulled down low over his eyes, which hid his face. This was the reason why his face was obscured. When he was working her, he always made sure to protect his hands by donning a pair of bright yellow rubber gloves. In addition to that, he was standing with a hammer in the right hand of his right hand. However, he did not start running. The only thing he was doing was heading towards her in a calm and determined manner. He was not doing anything else. The vast majority of people would experience a basic flight response if they spotted a complete stranger entering their home while they were wielding a weapon. This would be the case in the majority of families. A period of complete and utter powerlessness and horror would be experienced throughout this time. It is possible that they will scream, that they will freeze, and that they will promptly turn around and dash for the nearest exit without giving it a second thought. All of these outcomes are plausible. On the other hand, the vast majority of individuals were not like Susan Kuhnhausen. She was a nurse who worked in the emergency room, and she had spent the last 3 decades preparing herself for scenarios like to the one that she was currently facing. It was typical for the emergency room to be a chaotic place. You could not afford to be in a state of fear since it was a luxury product. Because of these circumstances, you were necessary to think quickly, act immediately, and keep control of the situation. Therefore, her training took over when she turned around and saw the man approaching her while holding the hammer. She was able to successfully complete the task. The feeling of fear was not the most prominent one in her mind. It was bursting with adrenaline, and she had a crystal clear grasp of what it was that she needed to accomplish in order to succeed that moment. She had no chance of evading him because it was impossible. The manner in which she dealt with him was direct. To put it another way, that was certainly the very last thing that he would have envisioned happening. She reasoned that he would not be able to obtain a full and forceful stroke with the hammer if she was able to shorten the distance between them as quickly as possible. This was the case in the event that she was successful in doing so. Within the span of a single second, a strategic decision was made, and it was a gamble that was conducted with careful consideration. She ran towards him at a faster pace than he was walking in her direction, and the look of surprise that was on his face could be seen even above the brim of his hat. She was able to catch up to him. In comparison to her height of roughly 5 feet and 5 inches, he was a good 50 pounds heavier than she was. She stood at a height of approximately 5 feet and 5 inches. He was roughly 5 feet 9 inches tall and weighed approximately 200 pounds. His height was approximately 5 feet 9 inches. The other side of the coin is that she struck him with the force of a linebacker. She threw her shoulder into his chest, which caused him to fall backwards and hit the wall. He was injured as a result. The effect of this was rather profound. In spite of the fact that he was able to swing the hammer and hit her once in the head, the blow did not have a great deal of force behind it because she was so close to him. Not only was it not sufficient to bring her to the ground, but it was also not sufficient to bring her under control from the beginning. As a result of the surge of adrenaline, she had very little awareness of what was taking place. She shoved him against the wall with all of her strength, while clutching him tightly and holding on to him with all of her strength. As soon as it happened, she started shrieking at him, demanding that he answer her questions. "Who are you?" "What do you want?" she inquired. In the back of her mind, there was a small part of her that was still thinking that most likely this was just a burglary gone awry. She queried, "Who are you?" It is likely that she will make an effort to convince him to leave by providing him with whatever it is that he desires, given the current conditions. The individual, on the other hand, did not articulate any statements. All he did was struggle against her while maintaining his focus on her. He did nothing else. As a consequence of this, Susan seized him with even greater force and pressed herself against the wall with far more force. And at that moment, the man started talking. I overheard him utter 2 letters. It was the only set of words that he would say for the rest of the discussion, and neither of them were anything else. And with a low grunt in his voice, he looked at her and added, "You're strong." He then continued his statement. Whenever Susan was exposed to that information, it was as if a switch was flipped in her mental process. Every single atom of hesitation and every single crumb of hope that this was nothing more than a basic theft went immediately after it was discovered. When you consider the manner in which he spoke and the look that was on his face, he was not present when the television and the jewelry that she wore were taken away from him. As a matter of fact, he was there for her. His goal was to end her life by taking her life. In addition, at precisely the same time, the remark that she had read in the beauty magazine entered her mind. I will not live in fear. This was no longer only a wonderful emotion, it had become imperative. I will not live in fear. She was committing to herself right now, and she was doing so right now. She was currently making the commitment. No, it is going to be okay for me to go through this. Suddenly, she experienced a burst of strength that was emanating from within her. She was able to successfully get the hammer away from him while she was still holding him against the wall. She was able to do this while she was still holding him against the wall. She pulled it up to her head, and with a piercing scream, she whacked him many times in the head with it. She did this while still holding it. It was, at one point in time, a total of 2 times. This is the third of 3 occasions he let out a grunt as a result of the agony, but he was able to retake control of the weapon and successfully remove it from her grasp on it. In spite of this, the instant he reached for the hammer, he exposed his neck to the surrounding environment. Another thing that Susan, the nurse who worked in the emergency room and was very knowledgeable about human anatomy, noticed was that she was starting to become more open. She made a rapid rush forward and grabbed his throat, her fingers pressing into the delicate tissue that was located underneath his throat. During that moment, she began to suffocate him to death for the first time. Immediately after that, the man's hands went straight to his own throat, and he made an attempt to remove her fingers from her body. He put a stop to the assault that was being attempted on her. When he reached this position, he was focusing all of his abilities on a single activity, which was breathing. The realization dawned on Susan that she had induced him to adopt a defensive position. For her, the circumstances were favorable. After that, she seized it with great force. Bringing her other hand up to join the first, she proceeded to squeeze it with all of her weight and all of her willpower. She did this until she was completely satisfied. During a large length of time, she engaged in this activity. There was a possibility that she could sense the cartilage that was beneath her fingers. She was aware of the specific area it was necessary to push in order to cut off his flow of oxygen to breathe. Then, in a last-ditch effort to make sense of what was going on, she yelled angrily at him, her voice piercing with the intensity of her feeling. When she said, "I'll call an ambulance if you tell me who sent you," she was attempting to give him a way out of the situation. This is a chance for him to live. The only thing that was required of him was to communicate. The man, on the other hand, did nothing more than glare at her with his eyes wide open in a state of dread and growl once again. It was his reaction to what he had said. This was not going to be a talk that he would have. From the very beginning to the very end, he was going to carry out his instructions. In addition, Susan was acutely conscious of the fact that she needed to proceed with the strategy that she had developed. But as she continued to hug him and watched his face turn a dark purple color, a component of her professional training, the component that was sworn to defend life, started to take impact. She was committed to protecting life. There was no question in her mind that she would end up murdering him if she continued to persist for even a few seconds longer than she had already done. During that very moment, when she was in the midst of this battle for her life or death, she was not sufficiently prepared to carry out the action. As a result, she determined her course of action in a split second. As soon as she let go of him, she threw him to the ground, on the ground. In spite of the fact that her lungs were on fire and her entire body was wailing, she turned around and began running forward in the direction of the front entrance. It was discovered that this individual was not finished. First, he sprung up from the ground with a speed that was astonishing, and then he continued to chase after her. Following the act of grabbing her by the ankle, he proceeded to trip her, which resulted in her falling to the ground with a significant amount of force. She rolled over onto her back as soon as she touched down, and it was only in the nick of time for her to become aware that he was standing on top of her. He was using the hammer once more, and he was raising it far over his head in preparation to bring it down with all of his strength. He was preparing to bring it down. That was the conclusion. This was the devastating blow that was administered. The instincts that Susan had, on the other hand, were more immediate. Nothing was going through her head at all. To put it other way, she reacted. On the inner region of his upper leg, she bit down as hard as she possibly could after jumping up from the ground and sitting up as rapidly as she could. She did this as quickly as she could. Without wasting any time, she completed this task. The force of her bite was so great that she tore through the fabric of his pants by using her teeth to force it through. An agonizing cry that was both piercing and terrible was given out by the man at that very time. His ability to swing even the hammer was above his capabilities. Both the shock and the anguish were too much for me to handle at the same time. In an attempt to get away from her, he began to move backwards while he was struggling to keep up with her. As soon as she arrived at that location, she released her grip on him, knelt down on one knee, and then hurled herself at him once more, this time biting him on the side of his ribcage. When she bit him once again, she did it with all of her vigor, and in the process, she tore through his shirt. Having been completely taken aback by the severity of her assault, the man was now howling at the top of his lungs, completely baffled by the intensity of her assault. Susan caught him at the moment when he was at his most vulnerable, and she was able to fling him back down to the ground. However, as the procedure was going on, she lost her equilibrium and fell out of the process just like he did. In the exact opposite direction of his back, she fell to the ground. In addition to continuing to flail around in an effort to get her, he continued to make attempts to seize her and hit her with the hammer. She extended her hand, wrapped her arm around his throat from behind, and exerted pressure at the same time in order to put him in a brutal chokehold. There was no way he was going to get out of that brilliant maneuver that was like something out of a textbook, and he had no intention of doing so. Despite the fact that the man was making an effort to resist in order to free his neck, his attempts were unsuccessful. And at that same moment, while she was holding him there, Susan made a decision that was unfeeling and definitive at the same time. This was not going to be a talk that he would have. Not only was he not going to say who had sent him, but he was also not going to share what he intended to tell her. His objective was to take her life out of the equation. With this new information, there was no longer any doubt. The conversation came to an end at this position. The choice was between him and her. To add insult to injury, she had already decided that she was going to live with the consequences. Since this was the case, she proceeded to kill him by strangling him. Up until the point where he stopped moving, she maintained a strong grip on him while delivering a moderate but steady amount of pressure. In a calm and collected manner, she rose up as soon as he became completely without movement. Having received confirmation from her expertise in medicine, she took a moment to look down at him. Her senses had already alerted her of what she was experiencing. It was after the fact. Following that, she got down on her knees, picked up his hammer, and then, with an unusually high level of serenity, she went out of the front door of her house. Through the course of her yard, she made her way to the residence of her neighbor and knocked on the door. She then proceeded to do so. When Susan's neighbor answered the door a moment later, she was observed standing on the porch of her neighbor's house, observing the situation. Her clothes were torn and frayed into shreds, and they were ripped. She had bruises and was covered in blood all over her body. Nevertheless, she behaved in a manner that was completely and utterly composed. Unbelief seized the neighbor in its embrace. Her first glance was directed towards Susan, and then she turned her attention to the hammer that she was holding in her hand. She then asked, "What on earth is going on? Where did she get a hammer, and how did she get it?" Susan delivered the information to her in a voice that was composed and steady throughout the entire sentence. "I had an intruder," she said, "and he tried to kill me, so I killed him. And I need to use your phone to call the police." Her neighbor, completely bewildered, but seeing the seriousness of the situation, just nodded and said, "Okay, come on in and use my phone." So Susan walked into her neighbor's house and, still holding the hammer, and she calmly called the police and told them what had happened. In a couple of minutes, the normally tranquil street in the suburbs was suddenly jammed with the flashing lights of ambulances and police cars. This occurred unexpectedly. Officers and paramedics entered Susan's residence with the utmost caution. After entering the building, they established the accuracy of the information that she had earlier supplied to them. Regrettably, her attacker had already passed away at that point. Another factor that contributed to the chaotic nature of the event was the presence of evidence of a violent conflict that was spread out across the living room and the corridor. The investigation was initiated by the police, who were attempting to put together what had taken place and what had transpired. The first thing that they needed to do was figure out who the person who had passed away was. They did not put in a significant amount of time. The name Ed Hoffey was associated with it. He was a veteran of the Vietnam War and had a long and varied history of rapping during the course of his career. It was the 59th year of his life. On the contrary, he was not a random burglar. During the course of their investigation, the crime scene unit discovered Ed Hoffey's backpack while they were processing the premises. It had been left in the guest room, which was the location where he had been hiding up until that point in time. After opening it with great caution, they continued their hunt for any clues that would provide an explanation as to why he was present in that location. They investigated the contents of the package and found a small notebook within. In the event that this notebook were to be utilized, the entire scenario would be completely revolutionized. A collection of handwritten notes which were contained in it were included in it. These notes were almost like a checklist. Included in the papers was a series of instructions that outlined what should be done after he had successfully murdered Susan. Items such as how to make the situation appear as though it was a robbery, where to dispose of the weapon, and how to flee without being discovered are examples of things that fall into this category. One of the orders on the list, on the other hand, was the one that brought the investigators to a complete and total halt. A command that was little more than 3 words in length was issued. It was written in the message, "Call Mike." Suddenly, this was no longer an incident of a home invasion that had gone horribly wrong. This was a completely different situation. On the other hand, this was an entirely other problem. The Mike in the journal had to be Susan's spouse, they decided almost quickly after reading it. They arrived to this conclusion almost instantly. It was a very thoughtful gesture on the part of the spouse, who had left her a note in which he informed her that he was going to be at the beach for a few days. An alibi that was immaculate and appeared to be unshakable was provided by the spouse, who came to the rescue. In order to conduct an interrogation, the police summoned Mike in for questioning. It is most probable that he arrived at the station with a sense of self-assurance, ready to play the part of the spouse who is utterly startled and filled with grief. He provided the investigators with his account of the events. He explained that he and Susan had been going through some issues and that he simply wanted to get away for a couple of days so that he could organize his thoughts. He believed that this would be beneficial. He had arrived to the coast as a result of his journey. As for Ed Hoffey, he stated that he had no idea who the person was or why he would be at his house. He was absolutely taken aback by the situation. He refuted everything that was being said. Having said so, the notepad was in the custody of the law enforcement officials. Moreover, it wasn't only the note that was the problem. They began their investigation further, and while they did so, they discovered additional evidence. The phone records that they found proved that Mike and Ed Hoffey had been in communication with one another in the days and weeks leading up to the incident. This information was discovered by them. During the course of their inquiry, they came across banking records that disclosed a substantial amount of money that had been transferred out of Mike's bank account. The strain of the material evidence began to cause his story, which he had painstakingly constructed as an alibi, to begin to fall apart. After being confronted with facts that could not be refuted, Mike reluctantly accepted his guilt. Not only that, but he shared every piece of information with them. The reconstruction of the crime was slowed down as a result of the chilling effect. As a matter of fact, it was discovered that Mike was not only unhappy with the divorce, but he was also furious about the consequences that it would have on his financial situation. Getting a divorce would have been extremely detrimental to his current financial circumstances. On the other hand, in the event that Susan were to pass away, he would be the beneficiary of the house, as well as their life insurance and everything else. His perspective was that it was a simple and uncomplicated solution to the problem. It was for this reason that he came to the conclusion that he would plot the murder of his wife of 18 years. He made a concerted effort to locate Ed Hoffey and then employed him, providing him with $50,000 to carry out the assignment to his satisfaction. Mike spent the morning of September 6th at home, laying the framework for Susan's passing while she was at work in the emergency room where she was saving lives. Mike was establishing the groundwork for Susan's dying all throughout the morning. He was the one who gave Ed Hoffey permission to enter the house they were staying in. Subsequent to directing him to the guest room, he provided him with instructions regarding where he should wait and conceal himself. He instructed him on Susan's working schedule, when she was most likely to return home, and the most efficient manner to surprise her. He also offered him with recommendations on how to surprise her. A moment later, as he was leaving, he scribbled out that spontaneous message and left it on the counter next to the microwave. His alibi consisted of a plain message that was intended to depict him as a man who was placed a considerable distance away and was completely clueless to the tragedy that was taking place in his own home. This was the most significant part of his alibi. The next thing that he did was get into his car and drive to the beach, where he waited for the one phone call that he had been looking forward to receiving. He received a phone call from Ed Hoffey, who informed him that the assignment had been finished being completed. It was a call that was never picked up by the recipient. In spite of the fact that Mike never mentioned his specific motivations in court, it was abundantly clear that he was driven by the desire to acquire financial gain. He was subsequently found guilty of soliciting the murder of his wife and received a sentence of 7 years in prison for his involvement in the plan. He was sentenced to serve 3 years in prison. Throughout her whole life, Susan Kuhnhausen has never been the subject of any criminal complaint. In point of fact, many members of her community hailed her as a hero for the acts that she took. A person who, when confronted with a violent predator in her own home, made the decision to make a conscious decision to avoid becoming a victim of the situation. She fought back against her attacker with such skill and intensity that he was entirely unprepared for what she had to offer. In the immediate aftermath of the execution of Mike's sentence, Susan initiated a legal complaint against him with the intention of obtaining $1 million. In the end, it was discovered that she had not done it for the purpose of gaining substantial financial gain. She carried out the action because she was resolute in her determination to establish beyond a shadow of a doubt that he did not possess any monies that were still available. She wanted to be completely positive about the fact that he would never again be able to afford to pay another hitman to come and do the job. She wanted to know that he would never be like that again. It turned out that Susan did not need to be concerned for a very long time because of what did occur there. Unfortunately, Mike would pass away while he was detained not long after that. Following the assault, Susan's story became a well-known legend in the neighborhood. This occurred after the assault on Susan. Through the utilization of her professional expertise and her amazing resolve to survive, she emerged victorious over a hired killer. She was the nurse that worked in the emergency room. In addition to being a story about amazing bravery, it is also a story about betrayal that is beyond anyone's ability to comprehend. On the same day that she started the day by reading a line in a magazine that declared, "I will not live an unlived life. I will not live in fear," Susan felt forced to take action in order to demonstrate how firmly she believed those words. She came triumphant from the struggle that she underwent to save her life. I want to express my gratitude for your presence here today. If you watched the program that was broadcast today, I would appreciate it if you could share your ideas with me in the comments area. Also, bear in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of true crime waiting for you to watch in one sitting right now. You may watch all of these episodes in one sitting till the next time we meet again. What's going on? Imagine being trapped inside a cold, sealed metal box 200 miles out in the middle of the North Sea with absolutely no way to escape. Around 10 in the evening on September 9th, 1975, a 24-year-old man named Roger Baldwin and his 29-year-old coworker, Peter Holmes, were doing exactly that. They were crawling on their hands and knees as fast as they could down a narrow metal hallway. Their knees banged against the hard steel floor, and their breath was coming in short, panicked gasps. They were not crawling for fun. They were running for their lives. And the reason they were crawling and not standing or running is because of where they were. They were living inside a pressurized underwater apartment located deep beneath the ocean waves, connected to an offshore oil rig. If you know anything about deep-sea diving, you know it is not as simple as just putting on a scuba tank, swimming down to do some work, and then swimming right back up. When a diver goes down deep into the ocean, the intense pressure of the water forces gases like nitrogen to dissolve into their body tissues. If they come back to the surface too quickly, those gases will form bubbles in their blood and tissues, causing a highly painful and often fatal condition known as decompression sickness or the bends. Because of this danger, divers who work on deep-sea oil rigs have to spend days or even weeks slowly decompressing in special chambers before they can return to the surface. For oil companies, having their workers spend days decompressing after every single shift is a massive waste of time and money. So, to solve this problem, they use a technique called saturation diving. They have the divers live inside a pressurized underwater apartment, which is basically a massive steel container resting on the ocean floor or suspended deep in the water. Inside this metal box, the air pressure is kept at the exact same high pressure as the deep ocean outside. This meant that Roger and Peter did not have to decompress every single day. They lived inside this pressurized apartment for their entire month-long shift. They slept in bunks, ate meals, and relaxed inside this metal tube. When it was time to work, they simply put on their diving gear, stepped through a hatch in the floor straight into the ocean, did their underwater welding or maintenance, and then swam back inside when they were finished. Their bodies stayed pressurized the entire time. They only had to go through the long, grueling decompression process one time at the very end of their shift. To help you visualize what this underwater apartment was like, imagine a heavy steel cylinder about the size of a small school bus. This metal tube was divided into a couple of rooms. One room had metal bunks stacked on top of each other where the divers would sleep. Another room had a tiny table where they could sit and eat. There was also a small toilet and a shower. Everything inside was metallic and cold. The walls were painted with a thick, waterproof coating, but condensation was always dripping down because of the freezing ocean water just on the other side of the steel. To get food and supplies, they had a special mechanism called a medical lock. This was a tiny hatch in the wall of the apartment with two heavy doors. The support crew on the surface would put food, clean clothes, or letters into the lock from their end, seal the outer door, and pressurize the small chamber to match the apartment pressure. Once that was done, the divers would open the inner door to pull the items inside. It was a highly claustrophobic and isolated lifestyle, but it paid incredibly well, and Roger and Peter were good at what they did. To make this high-pressure environment breathable, the air they breathed was not normal air. Normal air contains a high amount of nitrogen, which at these extreme depths becomes highly toxic and causes nitrogen narcosis, a condition that makes you feel completely drunk and disoriented. To avoid this, they breathed the mixture of helium and oxygen, known as heliox. But helium has its own strange effects. It makes your voice sound incredibly high-pitched, like a cartoon character, and it also conducts heat away from the human body much faster than normal air. This meant the divers felt freezing cold very easily, even in a room that would normally feel warm. The life support technicians on the surface had to constantly monitor the temperature and gas levels inside the chamber to keep them alive and comfortable. But on this particular night, Roger and Peter were not thinking about their comfort. They were terrified. The intercom inside their apartment had just crackled to life, and the voice of their surface supervisor, Reed Arnold, came through. Reed told them there was a serious leak in the hallway, the metal tube that connected their living quarters to the rest of the underwater system. If the hallway lost pressure or flooded, the consequences would be catastrophic. They had to get into their main apartment and seal the door behind them immediately. And so they scrambled through the narrow passageway, their hands slipping on the cold metal. They reached their apartment door, threw it open, scrambled inside, and slammed it shut. But the problem was, they were not safe yet. They could close the door from the inside, but they could not fully seal it. The way the system was designed, the final airtight seal had to be created by the supervisor on the surface. Reed had to inject helium gas into their room from his control panel. This extra gas would increase the pressure inside their apartment just enough to push the heavy door tightly against its frame, locking it in place and keeping them safe from the leaking hallway. Roger and Peter sat on the floor, their backs pressed against the metal door, waiting. They looked up at a small camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling. They knew Reed was up on the surface, looking at them through a black and white monitor. They could not talk back to him without a direct radio link active, but they hoped he was watching their every move and doing exactly what was needed to keep them safe. And then they heard a loud, sharp, hissing sound. It was the helium gas rushing into the room. The metal of the door began to creak and groan as the pressure built up, sealing them inside. They felt a massive wave of relief wash over them. They looked up at the camera, nodded, and mouthed the words, "Thank you," to the lens. They figured the danger had passed. Leaks were scary, but they were a known hazard of the job. They figured they would just wait out the repairs, so they took off their heavy diving gear, climbed into their bunks, turned off the lights, and tried to get some rest. But the problem was, up on the surface, Reed Arnold was looking at his control panel, and he was starting to panic. Reed was sitting in a warm, dry room on the oil rig, surrounded by dozens of gauges, dials, and switches. Even though the leak in the hallway was still an active issue, he was now noticing a brand new problem. According to his control panel, the door to Roger and Peter's apartment had not fully sealed. The indicator light was showing that there was still a slow leak. Reed knew that if the door was not sealed, the pressure inside the apartment would slowly bleed out. Over several hours, this would drop the pressure to a deadly level, and the two divers would suffocate. It was a slow-motion emergency. Reed knew he had to act. The only way to force the door to seal was to inject more helium into their room, increasing the internal pressure to push the door tighter against the seal. So, he pressed the switch, sending another blast of gas down into the chamber. But the indicator light did not change. It still showed that the door was unsealed. Reed looked over at the live camera feed of the room. He saw Roger and Peter suddenly jump out of their beds. They looked incredibly frantic. They rushed over to the door and started pulling on the handle, trying to force it open. But they could not budge it. Reed thought this made no sense. If the door was not sealed, why couldn't they open it? It should open easily if there was no pressure lock. He watched in disbelief as the two men suddenly stopped trying to open the door. They turned around, walked over to their bunks, and did something incredibly bizarre. They ripped the thick mattresses off their beds, threw them aside, and climbed onto the bare metal bed springs. They began rolling around on the cold metal, writhing in what looked like madness. At this point, Reed thought they were suffering from a diving-related illness. He thought they had breathed in too much carbon dioxide, or perhaps the gas mixture was wrong and they were hallucinating. It is a real thing called hypercapnia or gas toxicity, which can make divers act completely crazy. Reed figured there must be some toxic gas leak in their room. He thought the only way to save them and force that door to seal was to inject even more helium to flush out the room and lock that door down. And so, he kept pressing the button. He injected more and more helium into the apartment. But the truth of what was happening was far more terrible. And then, Reed finally looked closer at his control panel. He began to double-check his gauges and the wiring schematics. And that was when the horrifying truth hit him. He had completely misread the control panel. The apartment door had sealed perfectly the very first time. Roger and Peter were totally safe inside their room. The warning light Reed was looking at was not for the apartment door. It was for the hallway door, which was still leaking. Because he misread the panel, Reed had been pumping massive amounts of helium into a room that was already fully sealed. By doing this, Reed had turned their apartment
into a high-pressure pressure cooker. When you compress gas rapidly, it generates immense heat. This is a basic law of physics, but in that small space, it was a death sentence. The temperature inside Roger and Peter's room was skyrocketing. It was getting hotter and hotter by the second. The air was becoming thick and scalding. The men were not acting crazy because of gas madness. They were literally being boiled alive by the rising temperature of the air. They tried to open the door to escape the heat, but the extreme pressure made the door physically impossible to open. The pressure on the door was equivalent to several tons of force. In a desperate attempt to cool their burning skin, they ripped the mattresses off their beds. The mattresses were made of foam and fabric, which trapped the heat. The bare metal bed frames were bolted directly to the steel outer hull of the chamber, which was surrounded by freezing 40-degree North Sea water. They hoped that by pressing their bare skin against the cold metal bed springs, they could find some relief from the blistering heat. But it did not work. The pressure and heat kept rising until the environment became completely unlivable, and both men tragically passed away. It was a devastating accident that shocked the entire commercial diving industry. In the aftermath, investigators descended on the oil rig to figure out how such a terrible mistake could have been made. They conducted a thorough forensic analysis of the control room and the control panel itself. What they found was that the control board was designed in an incredibly poor and ambiguous way. The lines on the mimic diagram, which showed the layout of the valves and doors, actually crossed over each other. The indicator lights for the chamber doors and the hallway doors were placed right next to each other, with tiny, faded labels that were extremely difficult to read under stress. In the end, Reed Arnold did not face criminal charges. The official investigation concluded that the mistake was a direct result of design negligence on the part of the manufacturer, not personal negligence by the supervisor. It was a tragedy that led to a complete redesign of saturation diving control systems worldwide, ensuring that such a simple and fatal misunderstanding could never happen again. But for the families of Roger Baldwin and Peter Holmes, it was a haunting reminder of how a single misread light on a metal board could end two young lives in an instant. Fast forward to November 29, 1986, in a quiet rural town in Indiana. The air was cold and crisp, typical for late autumn in the American Midwest. The harvest season had just wrapped up, and the local farmers were busy storing their crops for the winter. At around 11:40 in the morning, a 36-year-old volunteer fire chief named Jack Schoffel was driving his fire truck down a quiet country road. Jack was a well-known and highly respected member of the community. In a small town, the volunteer firefighters are your neighbors, your friends, and the people you see at the local grocery store. Jack took his duties incredibly seriously. Next to him in the cab was his assistant chief, Donald Schnitker, who was also his close friend. They had received a call about a potential fire at a large local farm owned by a man named Jeffrey Wolf. As Jack pulled the heavy fire truck onto the shoulder of the road near the farm, he spotted Jeffrey standing near the edge of the property. Jeffrey was waving his arms, trying to get their attention, and pointing toward a massive metal storage building situated further back on the land. Jack and Donald hopped out of the truck and jogged over to meet him. Jeffrey explained that he had noticed smoke coming from the top of the building, and he was worried that the entire structure might catch fire. Looking in the direction Jeffrey was pointing, they could see a thin, pale plume of smoke rising from the top of the building. It was clear that something was smoldering inside, but from the ground it was impossible to see what it was. The building was a massive 80-foot-tall structure, and it was packed tightly. There were no side doors or low-level windows that allowed them to peer inside. The only way to see what was burning was to climb a long, vertical metal ladder that ran all the way up the outside of the building to a small access window near the very top. Jack and Jeffrey decided they would climb up to take a look, while Donald stayed on the ground to monitor the situation and prepare the truck's equipment. To understand what happened next, we have to talk about the physics of grain storage. Why is a grain silo so dangerous? To understand this, you have to understand how grain is stored and moved. In Indiana, farms grow millions of bushels of corn. When the corn is harvested, it is dried and loaded into these massive metal cylinders called silos. The corn is poured in from the top, forming a massive pile inside. But grain is not like sand or water. It does not flow perfectly. As the grain sits inside the silo, moisture can get inside. This moisture causes the corn kernels to stick together, forming a hard, crusty layer on the top surface. Below this crusty layer, the grain is still loose. When the farmer drains grain out of the bottom of the silo to sell it or use it, a massive empty space, a void, is created directly underneath the hard crust. This is called bridging. It creates a terrifyingly deceptive trap. To someone looking from the top, the surface of the grain looks completely solid. It looks like you could walk right across it. But in reality, it is like a thin sheet of ice over a deep, freezing lake. The moment any significant weight is placed on that crust, it shatters. And when it shatters, the person standing on it instantly falls into the empty void below. But it does not stop there. The moment the crust breaks, all the surrounding grain, thousands of pounds of loose corn, instantly collapses inward. It behaves exactly like a funnel of quicksand. Within seconds, the person is dragged down and completely buried under feet of heavy corn. Once you are buried in grain, it is almost impossible to escape. The weight of the grain presses against your chest. Every time you exhale, your lungs compress. But when you try to inhale again, the loose kernels of corn slide into the empty space around your chest, preventing your lungs from expanding. With each breath, the grain squeezes you tighter and tighter until you can no longer breathe at all. It is a terrifying way to die, and it happens to dozens of farmers and workers every single year. Unaware of the hidden danger waiting for them, Jack and Jeffrey began their long climb up the exterior ladder. The metal rungs were freezing cold against their gloved hands, and the wind whipped around them as they climbed higher and higher. It was a long, exhausting climb, but they finally reached the small window at the very top of the massive structure. When Jack peered inside, he could see smoke, but the interior of the building was packed so full of material that it was hard to pinpoint the source of the fire. To help navigate the space, Jeffrey had previously placed a large, thick piece of plywood on top of the contents inside, right below the window. This plywood was meant to act as a solid platform so someone could step inside the building without sinking. Jeffrey told Jack it was safe to stand on the plywood. Jack climbed through the window and stepped onto the wooden board. He stood there, balancing carefully like a surfer on water, looking around the massive dark space. He was able to locate the smoldering fire. It was small, but he did not have the right tools with him to put it out safely. Jack pulled his radio from his belt and called down to Donald on the ground. He told him they had found the fire and that they were going to climb back down to get their gear and hoses. Donald acknowledged the call and waited by the truck. But as Jack turned to walk back toward the window, he heard a low, deep rumbling sound right beneath his feet. Down on the ground, Donald was staring up at the top of the building, waiting for Jack and Jeffrey to appear. Minutes passed, but nothing happened. It was completely silent. Donald had heard a faint, muffled rumble from inside the building, but he did not think much of it at first. But as the silence dragged on, he started to get worried. He grabbed his radio and called out to Jack. There was no response. He called again and again, his voice getting tighter with worry. Still, nothing but static came through the speaker. Donald knew he could not climb up the ladder alone to investigate. Safety protocols dictated that he had to call for backup. If there was a dangerous situation up there, going in alone could just result in 2 casualties instead of 1. So, with a heavy heart, Donald radioed for emergency assistance. Within minutes, the quiet country farm was swarming with fire trucks, police cars, and rescue vehicles. Firefighters rushed up the ladder and looked through the window. What they found was a devastating scene of empty space. When Jack had stepped onto the plywood, his weight, combined with the shifting corn below, had caused the grain bridge to give way. The rumbling sound was the sound of thousands of pounds of corn suddenly shifting and pulling the plywood down. Jack lost his footing and was instantly swallowed by the corn. Jeffrey, seeing his friend disappear, desperately reached out to grab him. But as he did, he too lost his balance and fell into the shifting grain. The corn acted like quicksand, pulling both men deep beneath the surface within seconds. They were completely buried under feet of heavy grain, making it impossible to breathe. It took emergency crews nearly 3 hours of grueling work, using heavy bulldozers and cutting equipment to tear open the side of the metal silo to finally drain the corn and locate the bodies of Jack and Jeffrey. Both men had tragically suffocated. It was a shocking reminder of the hidden dangers of agricultural work, a simple inspection turning fatal in a matter of seconds. The entire town was devastated by the loss of their fire chief and a local farmer, and the community held a massive memorial to honor their lives. Now let us travel even further back in time, all the way to December 2nd, 1755. The setting is a cold, dark night on a barren, rocky reef off the southwest coast of England. Rising from this dangerous reef was a famous wooden lighthouse. The reef was notorious for wrecking ships, and the lighthouse was the only thing keeping sailors safe from a watery grave. Living and working on this isolated rock was a 94-year-old man named Henry Hall. Even though he was in his mid-90s, Henry was incredibly strong and active. He worked as a lighthouse keeper, which was a brutal, physically demanding job. There were no modern comforts on this rock. No electricity, no running water, and no easy way to communicate with the mainland. If something went wrong, you were completely on your own. Henry had been doing this job for decades, and he loved the isolation and the sense of purpose it gave him. He is still on record today as the oldest active lighthouse keeper in history. On this particular night, Henry was working with 2 other lighthouse keepers. But these 2 younger men had spent the evening drinking heavily. By midnight, they were completely passed out in their bunks, sleeping off the alcohol. Henry, being the responsible and sober keeper, knew it was up to him to handle the night shift. His duty was simple, but exhausting. Every 30 minutes, he had to climb the steep, winding stairs to the very top of the lighthouse into the area known as the lantern room. He had to make sure the light was burning brightly to warn passing ships of the deadly rocks below. Remember, in 1755, there were no light bulbs. The light was produced by dozens of thick tallow candles arranged on a massive metal chandelier, or candelabra, hanging in the center of the room. Above this chandelier was the roof of the lighthouse. To protect the wooden roof from the heat of the candles, the ceiling of the lantern room was covered in a heavy dome made of solid lead. At around 2 in the morning, Henry began his routine climb up the spiral stairs. He had done this thousands of times before. But as he neared the top, he noticed a strange, acrid smell in the air. It was the smell of burning soot. When he stepped into the lantern room, he looked up. He saw that the candles were burning, but the underside of the lead dome above them was smoldering. Over the years, a thick layer of black soot from the candle smoke had caked itself onto the lead dome. This soot was now catching fire, glowing red and releasing thick clouds of dark smoke. Henry realized he had to act fast before the fire spread to the wooden structure of the lighthouse. He decided to open one of the large glass windows of the lantern room to let the smoke escape. But this was a terrible mistake. Opening the window created a powerful draft. The cold ocean air rushed into the room, creating a vacuum effect. The sudden influx of fresh oxygen acted like gasoline on the smoldering soot. The ceiling instantly erupted into a raging inferno. The wood behind the lead dome caught fire, and the entire top of the lighthouse was suddenly engulfed in flames. Henry ran down the stairs to the bunk room. He grabbed his 2 colleagues and shook them violently, screaming that the lighthouse was on fire. But the men were so deeply drunk that they barely stirred. Realizing he was on his own, Henry ran back up the stairs to fight the fire. A few feet below the lantern room, there was a small outdoor balcony that wrapped around the outside of the lighthouse. Henry stepped out onto this balcony. Right above him, the wooden roof was burning fiercely, and the lead dome was starting to melt from the intense heat. On the balcony, there were several large wooden buckets filled with collected rainwater. Henry began grabbing these buckets and throwing the water up onto the burning roof. It was exhausting work for a man of any age, let alone a 94-year-old. The heat was blistering, and the smoke was thick and choking. Soon, his two coworkers, finally waking up and realizing the danger, came running up the stairs. They joined Henry on the balcony, grabbing buckets and throwing water onto the flames. At one point, Henry stepped closer to the edge of the balcony, directly underneath the burning roof. He lifted a heavy bucket of water, looked up at the melting dome, and threw the water with all his remaining strength. As he did, he felt a sudden, sharp, blinding pain rip through his body. The pain seemed to settle deep inside his stomach, burning like a hot coal. He stumbled backward, gasping for air. He looked at his colleagues in shock. They looked back at him and gasped. They could see smoke rising from Henry's clothes. He was on fire. His colleagues immediately grabbed their buckets and doused Henry with water, putting out the flames on his jacket. Henry was in agony, clutching his stomach and screaming that he was burning inside. Realizing the fire was out of control, Henry yelled to the others that they had to abandon the lighthouse. The three men scrambled down the stairs, ran out onto the rocky reef, and hid inside a wet stone cave near the water's edge. They huddled there in the dark, watching as the lighthouse burned to the ground. All through the night, Henry lay in the cave, groaning in pain. He insisted that his stomach was burning from the inside. His colleagues tried to comfort him, assuming he was just suffering from external burns and smoke inhalation. The next morning, a passing ship spotted the ruined lighthouse and rescued the three men. They were brought back to the mainland of England, and Henry was taken to his home. A doctor was called to examine him. Let us talk about Dr. Edward Spry. He was the local physician in Plymouth who was called to examine Henry Hall. When Dr. Spry arrived at Henry's home, he found the 94-year-old man in terrible shape. Henry had significant burns on his skin, but his main complaint was this unbearable, heavy, burning sensation deep inside his stomach. Henry looked the doctor in the eye and told him something that sounded completely insane. Henry said that while he was looking up at the burning ceiling of the lighthouse, a stream of molten lead had dripped down from the melting dome and gone straight down his throat. Dr. Spry did not believe him. At the time, medical science dictated that swallowing molten lead would cause instant death. The heat would immediately destroy the esophagus and cause the throat to swell shut, suffocating the person in seconds. The fact that Henry was still alive, breathing, and talking 12 days after the fire made the story seem physically impossible. Dr. Spry assumed that the elderly man was simply confused or hallucinating due to the extreme trauma of the fire and the inhalation of toxic smoke. He figured the pain in Henry's stomach was just a severe internal reaction to the hot gases he had breathed in. But after Henry died, Dr. Spry knew he had to perform an autopsy to find out the truth. He began the procedure, carefully examining the external burns. Everything seemed consistent with a standard fire injury. But when he cut open the abdomen and opened the stomach, he was met with a sight that made him freeze. Inside the stomach cavity was a solid, heavy piece of gray metal. Dr. Spry reached in and pulled it out. It was a flat, oval-shaped lump of solid lead. He weighed it, and it was over 7 ounces. It was nearly 4 inches long. It had literally shaped itself to the inside of Henry's stomach before cooling and hardening. This was an unbelievable medical discovery. Dr. Spry wrote a detailed scientific paper describing the case and sent it to the Royal Society in London, which was the most prestigious scientific institution in the world. But when the members of the Royal Society read the paper, they flatly rejected it. They wrote back to Dr. Spry, accusing him of making up the entire story to gain fame. They said it was a physical impossibility for a human being to survive for 12 days with a massive chunk of lead in their stomach. Dr. Spry was furious. He knew what he had seen, and he was determined to prove his critics wrong. To do this, he decided to conduct a series of controversial scientific experiments. He obtained several dogs and, under controlled conditions, he melted lead and poured it down their throats. He observed that the animals did not die instantly. Instead, they survived for several days with the solidified lead in their stomachs, proving that the human body could indeed survive such an extreme trauma for a period of time. When Dr. Spry sent the results of these experiments and the physical lead specimen to the Royal Society, they finally had to admit he was telling the truth. The piece of lead was preserved, and it became one of the most famous medical anomalies in history. Today, that actual piece of lead is still on display at the National Museum of Scotland. These three stories, separated by decades and centuries, show us how fragile human life really is. Whether it is deep beneath the ocean, inside a quiet farm building in Indiana, or on a rocky reef off the coast of England, a single split-second event can completely rewrite a person's fate. In each of these cases, the people involved were just doing their jobs, living their ordinary lives, and trying to handle what they thought were routine situations. But the unexpected physics of their environments turned those moments into unforgettable tragedies. It is a sobering thought. We go about our daily routines assuming we are safe, that we understand how the world works, and that the tools and systems we rely on will protect us. But sometimes a tiny detail is missed. A gauge is misread. A surface shifts. A single drop of liquid metal falls from the ceiling. And in those moments, the boundary between a normal day and a historical tragedy completely vanishes. We are left with the stories of those who survived, the lessons learned from those who did not, and the quiet, haunting questions that linger long after the smoke has cleared. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Tonight, I have two great stories, but I couldn't figure out how to tease them like I do at the top of these episodes. I realized that what makes these stories special is that they're both great campfire stories. Two teenage girls named Rachel and Molly lived in a quiet, rural New York in the late 1990s. Best friends, they were inseparable and part of a large high school group that spent a lot of time together. Still, Rachel and Molly had a special bond within that larger circle. Two of them were often seen together, sharing secrets and navigating high school. Love of goth culture brought them together and bonded their group. High school goths had a distinct identity in the late 1990s and early 2000s. It meant wearing mostly black. Black nail polish, lipstick, and a deep black hair coloring. Celebrate all things dark and macabre. Others saw it as a philosophical exploration of life's darker side and a way to express their non-mainstream feelings. Many saw it as a fashion statement, a way to stand out and feel special. It was a distinct subculture in the late 1990s, and Rachel and Molly were fully committed to it. They liked the music, fashion, and atmosphere. A favorite hangout for Rachel, Molly, and their goth friends was the local cemetery. It was initially a joke, an ironic performance of their identity. Where else would the goth kids hang out than a cemetery? Their first few trips there were humorous because it felt too predictable. Odd thing happened. The cemetery was actually cool to hang out in. They were never bothered there in the peace. So it became their seat. It was their weekend hangout. The cemetery was usually visited at night by Rachel, Molly, and their friends. This maximized the dark, spooky atmosphere they were going for, leaning goth. A more important rule was that they always went together. Rachel and Molly were never alone. They always hung out with several of their friends. This had several causes. First, more people meant more energy and conversation, making it more fun. Though they loved it, the cemetery was creepy at night. Numbers provided safety. It felt less intimidating and more like their own park with a group. Rachel was home alone on a Friday night, bored, when the phone rang. Was Molly. Caller Molly was cheerful. Rachel replied immediately when she asked, "Hey, you want to go hang out in the cemetery?" "Duh," she said. They did it on weekends. "I'd love to go." "Come pick me up." Rachel got ready after saying goodbye. It was her usual all-black outfit, makeup, and waiting outside for Molly's car. A few minutes later, Molly's headlights turned onto her street, and the car pulled up to the curb. Rachel saw Molly alone in the car first. It was odd. When they picked her up for cemetery nights, the car was usually full of friends. Rachel entered through the passenger door. While buckling her seatbelt, she asked Molly, "Hey, so where is everyone? Are we going to pick up the rest of the group now?" Molly dismissed her. "In fact, no," she said. "I tried calling everyone else, but they're all busy. Some are working, some are hungover from last night. It's just going to be us two at the cemetery. Is that okay?" Rachel had an uneasy feeling. Really, this was wrong. They did not do this. The cemetery hangout was about group dynamics and shared experience. Just one person made me feel more vulnerable. There was no problem with her closeness to Molly. Being in that big, dark cemetery without their friends made them uncomfortable. She looked over at Molly, who seemed to have accepted it. Rachel didn't want to be negative or crude. It seemed impossible to say no now. So she smiled and said, "Oh yeah, that's fine. It'll be great, just the two of us. Let's go." Despite her hesitation, she sat down and they drove the half-mile to the cemetery. The cemetery was massive. A massive, ancient burial ground stretched for miles. A massive, medieval-looking gate with a wrought iron archway spanned the entrance, greeted you as you approached. The archway made the gates look Gothic and imposing, even though they were always open. After passing that arch, a single road ran straight down the cemetery from front to back, probably over a mile. That road divided the grounds into two huge parts, the right and left. Molly, Rachel, and their friends frequented the back left corner. Terrain was their reason for choosing that area. Left of the cemetery were rolling hills where plots were laid out. That back left corner had a natural depression, a shallow bowl with few tombstones. At the bottom of this depression was a large boulder and tree. This place fit them. Standing at the main gate and scanning the vast cemetery, anyone sitting in that depressed area would be hidden. Teenagers wanted to be hidden, so they were. It was their secret hideout. So Rachel and Molly drove through the grand gate and down that long straight road to the cemetery's back. The sun had set and it was growing dark. Although it wasn't pitch black, the light was fading fast. Nobody was around, as usual. This time of night, the cemetery was usually empty. Local university students occasionally hopped the fence on the opposite side of the cemetery from them. They sometimes lit a bonfire against the fence on that side. Sometimes they sneaked over and did it, even though it was illegal. But that was unusual. Most of the cemetery was empty except for college students. They parked at the end of the road and exited. They descended the gentle grassy slope from the road into their usual gathering spot, the depression. At the bottom, they leaned back against the tree trunk on the big rock by their usual spots. They smoked cigarettes and talked as usual. Rural New York goth teens in the 1990s did this. They chatted about boyfriends, school drama, and stories. Light faded from the sky, making it completely dark. Girls still enjoyed themselves. Rachel was thinking this was kind of nice. Not as scary as she expected. It was calm and comfortable, and she was spending time with her best friend. They noticed a new smell after a while. Smoke smelled distinct. The bonfire spot across the cemetery was now remembered by both. Even though it was far away, college students could have started a fire. First, they glanced over that way and saw nothing, but they'd been hanging out for a while. While they were down there, those kids could have hopped the fence and started a fire. They weren't bothered by the fire. On the other side of the huge cemetery, it didn't affect their work. Rachel and Molly knew from past experience that the police always arrived at bonfires there. Predestined. They were kicked out after the police made the kids put out their fire. To ensure no one was around after hours, they always swept the cemetery. Even if they weren't starting fires, Molly and Rachel would be expelled. Rachel and Molly looked at each other as they smelled the smoke and agreed. Leave now before the police arrive and force them to. Additionally, they had been there for a while and were ready to leave. Their timeline accelerated slightly. It was fine. They extinguished their cigarettes, gathered their belongings, and walked back up the hill to the car. As they climbed the hill, they expected to see their car parked on the road. They hoped to see the tiny flicker of the bonfire they were smelling across the cemetery. They didn't see a fire on the cemetery's other side when they reached the hilltop. Instead, to their right, maybe 100 meters away, was another depression and rolling hill that dipped out of sight. They saw flickering flames from that direction. The fire started in the depression next to their cemetery, not across it. This was odd. This side of the cemetery was empty when they arrived. The place was empty. Someone had arrived while they were there and started a fire nearby. Never before had they seen this. It was strange. Nobody started fires here. What happened? Both girls wondered. They assumed the college students had tried a new place. They only saw the fire's tops rising from the ridgeline, not the people. The person over there probably didn't know they were here. They had an idea. Molly asked Rachel, "What if we go back down and sneak up the other side of our hill? We could poke our heads over and see who it is. We could spy on them." An exciting, slightly mischievous idea. Why not since they were here? Two girls agreed, turned around, and returned to depression. They climbed the hill opposite the mysterious fire, past the big rock and tree where they had been sitting for 2 hours. They moved quietly to hide. Rachel accidentally made noise as they approached the hilltop, where they could see the fire and whoever was there. In the quiet night, she stepped on a dry branch or loose rock, which cracked loudly. Fire crackling was the only sound. No one spoke from the other side. Rachel covered her mouth and stared at Molly. Molly asked, "What are you doing?" "We're trying to be quiet." Twin girls froze. They stood still, listening to see if the firemen heard them. It was silent. A spooky silence. The mood changed then. Something was off. Even though they hadn't reached the top of the hill or seen who was at the fire, their playful curiosity had turned into a cold dread. Both looked at each other and knew they were thinking the same thing. They agreed, maybe we should just turn around and leave. Yeah, let's get out of here. This doesn't feel right. As quietly as possible, the two girls turned around and returned to their depression. They quickly passed the rock and tree and returned up the hill to their car. Rachel glanced back over her shoulder at the hill they had just come from while walking. And what she saw chilled her. Man stood on ridgeline. The fire behind him silhouetted him, making him ominous against the orange glow. Standing still, he stared at them. Though silent, he watched them. It was him at the fire. The Rachel noise must have reached him. Molly turned and saw the man as Rachel frantically whispered, "Molly, look, look." She felt pure fear. "Let's get out of here," she panicked. "We don't know who that guy is." "We have to go now." They stopped, ran up the hill. Seconds later, Rachel glanced back. The hillman was gone. She thought he was gone, terrified. Then she saw movement in the darkness below. He ran down the hill toward them. Girl screamed. The grassy slope to the road was scrambled at full speed. The man was closing in, and Rachel kept looking back. He moved quickly. They ran to Molly's car after climbing the hill, their lungs burning. They fiddled with the doors, jumped inside, and slammed them shut, locking them. Molly started the engine, jumped out, and screeched tires on the asphalt. Rachel watched out the back window as they drove down the cemetery road. She saw him. Reaching the road, he was almost there. He paused as their car vanished into the night. After turning, he slowly descended the hill out of sight. Molly and Rachel were traumatized. Their hearts raced and they panted. That was no college student. That was a grown man, possibly in his 40s, unfamiliar to them. Everything felt creepy and dangerous. It baffled them. They kept asking, what would have happened if he caught us? What was he trying to do? What just happened? By the time Molly dropped Rachel off at her house, the terror had subsided and been replaced by cautious energy. They nearly laughed it off as a crazy night. Man, that was insane, huh? They told a wild story about a close call. They promised not to return alone at night. Rachel entered home. Never told her mom what happened. She put her things down, went to her room, and calmed down. Without telling anyone about their terrifying encounter, Molly did the same at home. They both went to bed to forget. The next morning, Rachel went downstairs to the kitchen. Mom was making coffee and going through her morning routine. She asked, "Hey, how was your night last night?" Rachel shrugged. "Oh, it was fine." Me and Molly went out. No big deal. Her mother looked serious. Ripped her head. "Oh, did you hear what happened last night?" Her mother asked gravely. "No, what do you mean?" "What happened?" "Well, a woman in our town got kidnapped. She was taken from the parking garage where I park for work. She worked in the same building as me." Rachel's wide eyes. The mother of Rachel breathed deeply. "No. I mean, yes, they found her. But unfortunately, it was too late. When they found her, she was dead. And whoever kidnapped and killed her, they brought her body to the local cemetery last night. And they burned her in a huge bonfire." Her mom let the words sink in. "Whoever did it still hasn't been caught." Hearing this felt like the floor fell out from under Rachel. Her world fell apart. Now, everything from the night before made sense sickeningly. They smelled no college party bonfire. Mom mentioned that fire. A man chased them and was the killer. The murdered woman's body was likely in that fire. They were just 100 meters from a killer dumping his victim's body. Scary thought. They likely witnessed the killer set the fire and start this horrific act. What if that man caught them? Were they to continue spying on him over the hill without Rachel's noise, what would he have done to them? Rachel broke down and told her mom everything from the night before. Horror struck her mother. Rachel called Molly immediately to tell her what she had learned. Caller Molly went hysterical. They realized how close they were to disaster. They presented their case to the police. They best described the man, but it wasn't much. They feared the dark. All they knew was that he was average-sized and probably in his 40s. It wasn't specific. Fortunately, police caught the killer 48 hours later. Not because of the girl's description, but luck. Police saw the victim's car driving around town. Car stopped, and the driver was the killer. After arrest, he confessed. Not surprisingly, Rachel and Molly never saw that cemetery the same. They feel lucky when they think about that night. Rachel's accidental noise as they approached the fire may have saved them. One accidental sound made them pause, reconsider, and turn around to leave. That saved them because if they had crested that hill and met the killer, they may have both died in that bonfire. I served in the military before starting this channel and telling strange, dark, and mysterious stories online. 7 years as Navy SEAL. I thought that was my life's purpose and career. Getting hurt made it not the right fit for me in the long run. The rest is history after I left the service. My military experience includes many funny stories about our brutal training and some scary stories about my overseas service. Experiencing my first deployment to Afghanistan has always stood out to me as a special memory. That it's not a war story helps it stand out. The Navy SEAL training took almost 3 years of my life. An arduous process. I finally arrived. SEAL Team 2 in Virginia was my East Coast assignment. We immediately started training for our first deployment and learned we were going to Afghanistan. This was in 2013, when going to Afghanistan meant fighting. There were active combat operations nationwide. Navy SEALs and other direct combat units want war. You've spent years training for it, not because you're a warmonger or love violence. You want to prove yourself and do your best after all your hard work. Thus, I was preparing for battle. It was deployment day. In a typical SEALs flight, the team isn't sent out together. It's unsafe. That plane crash could kill a platoon. You're sent out in small batches, sometimes on civilian flights for the first leg. I flew to South America with 2 other SEALs dressed as civilians. From there, we took a military transit flight into Afghanistan. I was focused throughout. The end. I've prepared for this. Here goes. The last leg of the trip, the flight into Afghanistan, was on that military plane. The military pilots made 2 changes when we entered active war zone Afghan airspace. A dark red replaced the aircraft's white overhead lights. They then told us to avoid windows over the intercom. We were approaching the most dangerous part of the flight, landing. You didn't want to sit next to a window if the plane was shot at from the ground. It wouldn't matter where you were sitting if the plane was hit by a rocket-propelled grenade, but it was a stark reminder that we were about to enter a war zone. Also intense was landing these large transport planes in combat zones. They needed to minimize ground-level small arms fire at them. Lower people are more vulnerable. They would land combatively. They would dive straight down toward the runway and pull up at the last second to land abruptly. It was rough. We were on this crazy landing, red lights glowing, everyone tucked away from the windows, and my mind kept repeating, "Okay, we're ready for Afghanistan." Fob Shank is a well-fortified base where we landed safely. The massive ramp at the back of the plane lowered after taxiing. Since my gear had been shipped on pallets weeks earlier, I grabbed my pack. I had only my backpack. I and a teammate walked down the ramp onto the tarmac. We existed. First sighting of Afghanistan. I didn't see the country the first time because the plane windows were tiny portholes and we were told to avoid them. Honestly, standing there and looking around was breathtaking. Afghanistan's beauty is astounding. These massive snow-covered mountains and beautiful wide-open fields surrounded us 360 degrees. The land appeared unspoiled. The jagged scar on the earth was the NATO base, where war was launched. Contrast was striking. I didn't understand. This place was too beautiful to fight. That feeling did not last. We were quickly led to a holding area, grabbed our gear, and loaded into MRAPs or heavily armored military vehicles. These are IED-resistant 50-ton beasts. We drove from that big base to a smaller, more remote, forward operating base in the sticks. It was more vulnerable, and we would operate there for 6 months. Our new home arrived late that night. This primitive outpost was in the middle of nowhere. When we arrived, the SEAL team we were replacing was finishing their deployment. There were interpreters who are crucial to the war effort. These interpreters were mostly 20-somethings who had worked on these bases with American units for years. They couldn't leave the base because they worked with NATO. As traitors, the Taliban and other militant groups targeted them. These interpreters believed that working with NATO would allow them to leave Afghanistan and immigrate to the US. Some fulfilled that promise. And these guys were tough. They fought more than most soldiers. They witnessed some incredible events. I met our partner force and interpreters right away because my platoon role involved working closely with them. SEAL Team 8, already there, was crazy. There had been 6 months of fighting. These huge men with massive beards seemed unconcerned about everything. My first night, I was super green. I met with one of our interpreters to learn the scope and expectations. We discussed possible operations and got to know each other. This 25 or 26-year-old interpreter leaned in and said, bro, and they all used American slang they picked up from being around young soldiers and Marines all day. He asked, "Bro, have you heard the story of what was in the cave in Kandahar? We were in a different province. I soon learned that local interpreters and soldiers had a persistent, almost legendary story about a giant, big humanoid creature that lived in a cave in Kandahar's mountains. Afghanistan has endless mountains and caves. Humans have probably never explored many of these caves in remote areas. Indeed, this interpreter was serious. He declared, "Bro, I'm telling you, it's real. There was a giant up in the caves in Kandahar. Have you heard about this?" He seemed curious and wanted to know more. It planted a seed in my mind without further discussion that night. This interpreter, who had seen real combat and was not prone to fantasy, believed this weird story. The idea stuck. Many years later, I'm out of the military and writing strange, dark, and mysterious stories online. At the start of the channel, I was thinking about what stories to tell, and remembered the Kandahar giant. It seemed like a good idea to investigate what my interpreter was saying. I found this treasure trove of testimony from a specific group of Green Berets, a special forces team that had a very real and very strange encounter in Kandahar caves. One soldier, anonymously known as Mr. K, due to fear of repercussions for speaking out, gave shocking testimony about what they saw. I wanted to compile all the notes and tell my interpreter's story from years ago. I'll repeat that story tonight. An Army infantry unit patrolled Kandahar in 2002. Imagine huge, snow-covered peaks and deep valleys. In 2002, these patrols searched for Taliban hideouts and cave systems or enemy fighters in valleys below. These patrols were routine. Soldiers, regardless of branch, update their superiors while on patrol. Routine or not, most operations are planned. Everything is planned: when you arrive, how long you'll stay, your goals, when you leave, and how you'll leave. It's organized. This infantry unit patrolled routinely. However, their higher command lost contact with them mid-mission. A red flag was raised immediately. A unit's communications were sometimes lost. It's hard to send radio signals across huge mountain ranges with imperfect equipment. Usually, lost communications are recovered quickly. A long time passed without this unit's response. As the higher command debated whether to send a quick reaction force or air assets to find them, something even more alarming was noted. The unit went silent without calling a TIC first. A TIC troops in contact indicates a gunfight. This step is crucial. If you're shot, your command doesn't know. Call it in. A support system activates when you do. Air support, medical evacuation, and reinforcements may be needed. Someone on the ground yells tick, tick, tick into the radio when a firefight begins. Everyone is on alert to help. Soldiers call in ticks too quickly because they're like cheat codes for overwhelming support. An engagement of this magnitude rarely goes unreported. To have an entire unit go silent without calling in a tick was strange. It meant it was either a massive, unprecedented radio failure or something else that didn't fit combat patterns. After a while, the Army decided to send an elite unit to find the unit. The mission was given to the Army's top special forces, the Green Berets. Mr. K was in that Green Beret detachment. Mr. K's small team of Green Berets took helicopters to the remote Kandahar area where the infantry unit was last seen. The landing was as rural as it gets. Only the occasional mud hut existed. That mountain range was vast and empty. It can feel like another planet. There was nothing to see. All around was a wasteland, no locals or Americans. People knew the search area was huge and the terrain was rough. Hiking through the mountains to find the missing soldiers would be difficult for several days. Each carried a heavy pack of ammo, water, and gear. They hiked the missing unit's rough route. Hiking through the mountains yielded nothing. For several days, they hiked all day. They had a few distant enemy encounters, but nothing major. They were searching for missing soldiers, not fighting. Hiking, they searched the landscape for clues. Days went by with no results. On their fourth day of searching, Mr. K and his team saw a goat trail ahead while walking through a mountain range. The narrow path climbed and crossed the mountain. So they took it. No intelligence led them there, but it was a trail which was easier to walk on than the rocky terrain they had been navigating. They thought they'd follow it across, get a better view, and spot something in the next valley. Therefore, Mr. K and the Green Berets started up the winding goat trail. As they walked, they saw plastic and metal fragments on the path. They were initially unidentified. While climbing, they realized these were military equipment fragments. Radios and other equipment from an American infantry unit were included. Their senses were primed. The men had rifles ready, including Mr. K. They climbed the trail more cautiously, knowing they were on the right track, but that they could face danger. On top of this mountain, what would they find? Bloody ambush grounds? Surviving unit members? Unaware. Evidence increased as they hiked. Large radios and military backpacks were found. They found uniforms with name tags and unit patches. They now knew the uniforms belonged to the unit they were looking for. They had found their first real lead, and it looked bad. They reached Trail's peak. Green Berets are the world's best trained soldiers. Regardless of how bizarre, their training would take over. They would have moved precisely and confidently, ready for anything. After climbing the trail, Mr. K and his team reached a flat plateau. 3 massive cave entrances opened up onto the plateau like front porch doors as the mountain rose above it. More military equipment was scattered on this plateau, but this time it was different. Some bones were human. Human bones were scattered. No one was here. If the missing unit were here, something terrible had happened to them. Green Berets set up defensive positions around the plateau immediately. It was imperative to clear those caves. Inside were survivors? The perpetrators were inside? To investigate, Mr. K and his shooting partner had to approach a cave entrance. The team supplied cover and watched all angles as they crossed the plateau silently. Mr. K entered with his partner. A huge opening could be walked into, but it was dark inside. It took a few steps into the cave for his eyes to adjust to the darkness. Trying to spot anything, he noticed a sheer drop inside the entrance. Cave floors fell into deep pits. Though he stopped in time, he couldn't see the bottom in the darkness. As he stood up, he saw movement in the cave's back, across the deep crevasse. On instinct, Mr. K raised his rifle to shoot. He was stopped by a huge spear, like a javelin, flying out of the darkness. Impaling his partner, Soldier Dan, sent him flying backward out of the cave entrance. The team witnessed it. A huge humanoid creature bounded out of the cave in seconds. It was 12 feet tall, with fiery red hair and beard. It wore animal skins and had 6 fingers and toes on each hand and foot. It jumped the crevasse and stormed the plateau. The Green Berets fired upon it as it ran out, likely to attack the team. In seconds, a hail of bullets killed the massive creature. What happened was beyond anyone's comprehension, but their training kicked in again. Then they rushed to Dan to treat him after the threat was gone and the caves were empty. Too late. He left. The team faced an impossible situation. They had killed a 12-foot giant, lost a man, and hadn't found the missing unit. Team leader called higher command on radio. He responded with, "You have to come get us. I can't even tell you what just happened, but we have a man down, and we have this, combatant. You need to get out here, and you need to take this thing too." 2 helicopters soon followed. One was returning the Green Berets and Dan's body to base. Another helicopter's cargo net was huge. They carried the dead giant in the net, attached it to the helicopter's underside, and flew away. Standard procedure for Mr. K and his team was to return to base and debrief the mission. Your after-action report details what happened. Upon returning, something was different. They received no visitors. Just record what they saw and leave it. So did they. They recorded the giant attack. But higher command told them they couldn't include those details in their report. They were told to alter. They were told, "We can't say you fought a giant in a cave." Change the report. Despite knowing it was a lie, they rewrote the report to say they encountered a normal threat who killed Dan with small arms fire. They had to sign non-disclosure agreements to keep quiet about what they saw in the cave after submitting the false report. After that, they were told to forget. When they tried to find more information, all official reports about that operation were heavily redacted or classified. No one told Mr. K what happened to the missing infantry unit. It was all a black hole mystery. In 2016, 14 years have passed. K decided to reveal the truth. He thought it was wrong to hide what happened and how his friend Dan died. They agreed after talking to his teammates. He told his story because of that. When he did, he found other military personnel had seen the giant. At the airfield where the giant's body was brought, pilots saw a 12 to 15-foot tall creature with 6 fingers and 6 toes loaded onto a transport plane. They were told to never mention it and to remove it from their reports. Everyone who encountered this creature was sworn to secrecy, and the government tried to hide it. The story confuses me. Some part of me wants to trust Mr. K and others. I remember my grounded interpreter in Afghanistan believing something strange was living in those caves. Perhaps possible. You feel like anything could be hidden in those mountains in that ancient alien landscape. With an infantry unit still missing and a Green Beret who was killed in action, his team wants the truth about his death told. Government concealment seems obvious. They may be hiding something, but this story seems to have more to it. Much obliged for watching. Leave a comment on today's episode. We have a whole playlist of true crime episodes to binge from. Next time. Farewell.